We're to call this meeting to order. First of all, we'd like to thank everybody for attending this November 7th, 2023 meeting, and a special thanks to always have Select Water with us. And we're learning from them, so thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Toma,
Here.
Commissioner Glick is excused. Commissioner Hosey. Commissioner Cott. Commissioner Lawson. Commissioner Pence. Commissioner Suker.
Here.
He's excused.
Here.
Oh, there you are. Thanks, Larry. Got it. Secretary Lee Craig is excused. Secretary, Vice Chair Lisa Anselmi, I'm here, and Chairman Kaylee.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Hey, Director.
You guys hear me okay? All right, the first item we have on our agenda is the High Savior Reservoir lands grazing discussion. And this came from, I guess, Select Water Committee, Joint Ag Committee back in September up in Pinedale. And I mentioned this at our October meeting that there are some landowners, or a landowner, I'm not quite sure which, that are adjacent to the High Savory Reservoir project that would like to have the state consider potentially grazing some of the property. And if Megan could bring up our first map, I'll get you guys situated in the world. This is a pretty small map, but bear with me here. Okay. So High Savory is up here. And when that was built, of course, we had to have a 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers because we were inundating waters of the U.S. and putting dredge fill into waters of the U.S. So as part of that, you end up at the end of your environmental NEPA work with some mitigation that you have to do based on the impacts you had. And some of those impacts were associated with wetlands that were inundated by the reservoir, and some were upland areas. And then we also had some riparian areas. I think there was maybe some cottonwood galleries that were inundated as part of the reservoir project. So when you go through NEPA, then they ratchet those up. So if you had, 1 acre of wetland, we probably had to mitigate it with 2 acres of wetlands. And I think the riparian was a 1-to-1, the upland was a 1-to-1, and I believe the riparian was a 3-to-1 mitigation, if my memory serves. So, as part of that, like I said, the High Savory's up here. Savory Creek runs down through here, and about 30 miles or so downstream on Savory Creek, we have what we call the McMillan Place, and that's where the mitigation for the riparian area was done. So we'll zoom in. If you can go to map number 2 real quick here. Okay, so now we're just looking at High Savory. We have, as part of the project, we took over a existing state lands grazing lease from a gentleman named Lee Johns. And we currently still have that lease, and we subcontract that or sublease it. And that's the area down here, the state land, to the Hogeye Ranch, which is an adjacent landowner at this point. And it's gone through a couple different folks, Matt Myers after Lee Johns, and now on to Hogeye Ranch. And that was really negotiations and change in management of ranches and what worked out best for the Johns family initially that we made a commitment to. And Myers was a longtime ranch hand. They took over for when Lee passed away. And then it just made sense because of the adjacent property and where Hogeye Ranch had a grazing lease up north, that Matt Myers and Hogeye kind of did a swap to make their operations work well. So when we originally acquired that state lands grazing lease, we fenced out an area right here for where we mitigated our wetlands. And they're basically, most of them are right along the creek channel, and they're either sub-irrigated, or we've got some up here right below the reservoir that are actually irrigated with reservoir water. And we are required by that 404 permit to maintain those in perpetuity or forever. As part of the purchase or as part of the construction of the reservoir, there was a purchase from Don Stratton, who was a landowner of this property to actually build the reservoir on. And it's real hard to see, but that was about 2,100 acres or so purchased. And with the reservoir, you've got, roughly 250 acres within that polygon that are inundated with water now. So you end up with around 1,800 acres or so that are still above reservoir level. And the upland mitigation area in our 404 permit is this area in purple of about 500 acres here. And Water Development's name is still on this property. We have not grazed any of that land since the reservoir was constructed. What we call pasture 2, or the north pasture of that original grazing allotment that we got from Lee Johns, that's all fenced out. And again, that's really associated with our wetlands. So we have not grazed that either. Go to the next slide real quick, or next map. Okay, so this is a zoomed in of the area that was 30 miles downstream, the McMillan place. And it is roughly 1,100 acres. And it's a little difficult to see with this aerial because we've got cloud cover, but the stream channel runs through here, and the riparian mitigation area is for the most part along the stream channel. So when we had the request to look into this, I pulled out our 404 permit and was looking at some of the stipulations within that permit. So in the wetlands, the ones that are right below the reservoir, it states in here that the permittee, no grazing of wetland mitigation areas will occur prior to success. Those were signed off on. Oh, I'm not going to be able to remember exactly when, but it's been a few years ago. Do you remember that off the top of your head? Which one? 2018 was when we had to, we no longer had to provide annual reports on that because Corps of Engineers considered them successful as far as they were trending in the right direction, or we had the number of acres we needed established, whether it was shrub or palustrian wetlands. It then goes on to say all wetland mitigation sites will be contained within permanent fenced areas, which we have. Once mitigation success is established, the permittee can request the use of livestock grazing as a management tool. So in the past, when we've talked to the Corps, it's been, if we have an infestation of an invasive plant species or something like that, maybe some short-term high density grazing to come in there and knock that back would be something that would be a management tool. It says any livestock grazing will require approval by the Corps after consultation with the Wyoming Game and Fish prior to its initiation. And this, so why don't you go back to the first map again? This area up to the north here where the reservoir is, this land downstream is a kind of a concoction of a little bit of land Water Development owns, state land, Office of State Lands and Investments, and then BLM land. So we do have an MOU with the BLM that was associated with the original right-of-way permits to build the reservoir and put some of these wetland mitigation areas down there. So then also goes on to say the MOU is to ensure that no grazing will occur in a mitigation area unless approved in accordance with other conditions in the 404 permit, that grazing can be allowed as a management tool with BLM approval. And then on land managed by BLM, no exclusion or resumption of grazing will take place without the BLM's review and concurrence. So those are kind of the stipulations with the 404 on the wetland areas right below the reservoir. And again, I don't think that those are really ripe for something that we want to graze on an annual basis. It's kind of what I mentioned. If we have a bunch of thistle in there, we just can't control, then maybe it's appropriate for, something that's not long-term. So the riparian area, which was the area down south here in purple, the stipulations in that say, with approval of the Corps, livestock grazing can be used as a tool to enhance or maintain the riparian mitigation area, specifically willow and excuse me, and alder communities. Says additional baseline data that entails on-site evaluations, on-site transects, and photo monitoring shall be collected prior to the start of any grazing for the purpose of comparative analysis to determine the effects of grazing. So I think you'd have to have a plan in place. You'd have to do some preliminary work to show that you're actually benefiting that mitigation area with the grazing management plan that you put together. And then lastly, excuse me, the upland area, which was a small area to the south of the reservoir, talks about exclusion of livestock grazing to occur for a period of at least 5 years. It may be extended if necessary to achieve, thank you, mitigation success, or reinstated to maintain mitigation success. And then it also talks about once the initial 5-year exclusion period is ended, some controlled livestock grazing could be permitted. And if it can be shown to be beneficial to the upland habitat and permitted by the Corps. So there's stipulations associated with grazing in general, or in summary. Cindy Hernandez with our Dam and Reservoir group had a phone call with the Corps, or some kind of back and forth phone calls, and they're not opposed to grazing necessarily, but that we would have to basically come up with a grazing management plan that then they would have to review and approve. And they said you could start that off with a request that, hey, you're interested in grazing. We turned around and did that. And because they said they could provide us with some grazing management plan examples of what that might look like. We have not received anything like that to date. So I would say, we can continue to work with Senator Hicks and the potential interested landowners, and continue to work with the Corps of Engineers to understand what would this look like, some kind of a grazing management plan. Talked to Senator Hicks a little bit about the upland area and having somebody that's more familiar with range management maybe come out next spring and look at those areas. We used to have an individual that was more adept at that has retired from our office, but I remember talking to him at one point in time where, if you had some cattle in here and certain times that could improve things. So I think there's some potential there, not so much in the wetland area right below, but some potential in the upland area and possibly the McMillan area or the riparian area downstream. With that, I did also talk with our AG's office to understand, do we have the authorization to graze lands that we own? And I think I'll have Patrick come up for just a second and talk just for a short period on that.
Thanks, Chairman, Commissioners. Thanks. The Water Development Commission, it does not have the specific authority to lease generally in statute. However, the commission does have authority to operate and maintain property that it owns. For lease could be part of this operation and maintenance plan that Jason discussed. In order to lease the property, it would have to go through a process with the Wyoming Office of Administration and Information, A&I, the procurement process. What that looks like exactly, I'm not sure at this juncture, but I think it's just good to be aware that it does have to go, any lease does have to go through that process. I'm not sure, to be honest.
This might be a quick question for Senator Hicks. If I remember right, there was some recent legislation on grazing, and maybe there was some preference to adjacent landowners. I can't recall for sure. But what I'm hearing from Patrick, I don't know if that ended up being a public.
Yeah, that was for vacant permits on state leases. And regarding, going through A&I, we lease, a couple million acres of state institutional lands, university land. None of those go through A&I. Those go through the state land board. And so I think we need to look at that. This is a grazing lease, not a building lease that A&I normally looks at. So I'm just cognizant of the fact that the entire state land portfolio that the state has. That goes through the state land board as far as grazing leases. The bill specifically that you're referencing were vacant leases that had been vacated, and there was no existing permittee on those leases. So I'm not so sure that, and I would say also, just as I set through your presentation, I don't know that you'd want to exclude those riparian areas. There is a preponderance of research that's done by Dr. Knight down in CSU that's looked at some of these issues. And actually you can increase biodiversity by prescriptive grazing. It doesn't just have to be control of noxious weeds. There's other tangible benefits that we would want to look at. So I think there's going to be some opportunity to do that here. One of the things that I hear from my constituents over there a lot, one of the things that would be valuable for the program is once you issue a grazing lease, typically your responsibility for maintaining any of those range improvements, in this case, is fence. And each one of these properties has a significant amount of fence in it right now that through the commission is funding all the maintenance of those fencing around those properties. Those could be potentially assigned to a potential grazing leasee. So I wouldn't exclude the riparian stuff. I probably would concur. It wouldn't be on an annual basis. But I think what we would want to do is just engage probably some of the range people from the University of Wyoming, Department of Ag, and maybe Soil Conservation Service, and start to develop a plan for these properties that could come back to and present to the Corps for approval and Game and Fish Commission also. But I think we need to look at the whole thing. I think we also need to look at this leasing provision too. I just don't think that we're going to start having A&I do grazing leases. But that's my thoughts, but specific on your question.
Yeah. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know that we as in the Water Development Commission have authority like state lands to put out leases for grazing. Our authority would be more in the management of the land we do have and the management of High Savory Reservoir, or for instance, the management of our assets associated with Healy Reservoir and Lake DeSmet, where if it's meets what we're talking about in a 404 permit regarding maintaining riparian areas, or as a management tool, that probably fits into more of that. We're not grazing it to, you know what I'm saying? So
yeah,
it's a roundabout way.
Mr. Chairman, as the department or as the commission continues to potentially acquire property, I think this is a real easy fix. We just probably in one of the omnibus water bills or even a separate bill, just provide that authority to the commission to issue grazing leases for property under your control. I don't want another third party looking over the property that you guys are obligated to maintain. A&I does not have the technical expertise to administer a grazing lease. So if we need to do that, we need to get a little bit more information from the AG's office. But I think that's how we'd want to handle that, is just make sure that it's explicit in your statutes that any land under the control of the commission, that you have the authority to issue whatever it may be, recreational leases in the future for boat ramps or concessions or a whole range of things. That may be just something we need to clear up a little bit. So.
Mr. Chairman, the only other thing I would say, and we can continue to look into this, would be when we get into grazing management plans. I'm not a range, management person. I don't know what fees would be associated with the Department of Ag or the university or somebody coming out and looking at this. I think it would be something the commission would need to consider, is how much of that should be put on the, originally I was going to say on the folks that want to graze this to come up with a grazing management plan, but it would probably be some kind of a public bid process of some sort. So we don't know who's going to graze it yet or if it'll be grazed. Obviously, this all needs to go through the Corps of Engineers too. So there could be an expense of looking into and putting together that grazing management plan for the different areas. Okay. More to come, I guess, in the future. We'll continue to have conversations about this. Okay. All right. Our next agenda item is the critical aging irrigation infrastructure assessment level 1 study. And we have Jay Shug and Jill Peel with Tri-Hydro. So this is a study that was started, I think about a year and a half ago or so. And we are getting close to having a draft report. And just going to get a little update to everybody on how that study has gone and what we're getting out of it.
Working? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for having us. We're excited to present this. And just to set the stage for my talk, a lot of you have been to my talks before at conferences or our public meetings on this. You know, I can go on and on and on. So if you have a question during the talk, feel free to throw something or holler and be happy to get it, or you can wait till we're done. But keep it kind of informal. I want to talk first about a little bit, bring everybody back to speed, why we're here. I'll show you what we did to complete this project. It's still draft, and then some thoughts on the future. But as everybody in this room is aware, Wyoming's infrastructure is aging. We've got, just for perspective, we've got over 2 million irrigated acres in the state. There's 50 irrigation districts, and there's going to be thousands of private canals and ditches in addition to those. And some more perspective, like Midvale is the largest entirely within the state. There's close to 4,000 structures just in that district. Goshen has a couple thousand, Cade has a couple thousand. Now that's counting everything from the main diversion down to the farm turnout. And we're not going to that level of concern in this project. We're looking at the bigger conveyance structures. But even with maintenance, with age comes deterioration. There's no way of stopping it. We've had some recent failures that have brought this all to the forefront. And aging infrastructure was the #1 priority topic at the 2020 Joint Ag Committee session. And a little more background, the graphic there shows of the Water Development Office's irrigation system survey. It shows basically just the distribution of age, and these are approaching 50 to greater years in age. Most of the big districts, the reclamation construction, were back in the 20s and 30s. So we're at 100 years on a lot of these structures. Photo on the left is the Goshen Tunnel as it is right now. We all know it failed and instantly cut off water to over 100,000 acres. The photo in the middle is a photo of a failing concrete liner. It conveys it's on the order of 1,000 CFS, I believe, and it's perched on a hillside above a state highway. So there's a potential for not only loss of irrigation and interruption, but potential damage to infrastructure and possibly loss of life. And the photo on the is just an example of what old concrete can look like. That's kind of the worst end of the scale. Some of the structures we've seen that are that age are in remarkable condition. It's amazing. So, but that's what we can be facing. So the types of structures we're dealing with are what we're calling critical. They're essentially ones that if they fail, there's going to be some sort of interruption to whatever irrigation entity that, so we're talking about diversions, tunnels, siphons, anything that's in the line of the canals, not measurement devices or farm turnouts. So these are our tasks that were on our contract. And I'm just going to run through each of them briefly. And again, speak up if you have any questions as we're doing this. This relied primarily on existing information. So the first source of data was the legacy of projects that have been completed and funded by the Water Development Commission. So Tony Bergantino and his crew at Words responded remarkably to our request and gave us the digital information, the files to over 120 projects that have been completed. Out of those, that included the GIS data and the associated files. So we ended up with 35 individual databases from previously completed master plans. The rest of the projects were, say, level 2 studies on an individual structure that would be in those level 1s. But the big takeaway was there was 35 databases, and those were completed by 14 different consultants. The Water Development Office's irrigation system survey gave us a lot of qualitative information on the condition of things and the concerns of irrigators in the state, but it also gave us the contact information to 157 irrigation entities that we used later. The Interstate Council on Water Policy has been doing a survey of regional states, because we're not the only ones facing this issue. So they did some research on what other states are doing. So we met with them, got their information on what they have found. State Engineer's Office provided us a database of all the dams in all the high hazard dams. Reclamation met with us here in Mills, gave us a database of their recommendations that have come out of their on-site inspections, and that was provided to us under a non-disclosure agreement. And then finally, the BIA gave us infrastructure survey information on what's happening up on the Wind River Reservation. So our outreach was extensive. We started out, even before we got this project, by creating a logo. The purpose was to create a brand that would then promote consistent identity with the project. So we use that on everything, any correspondence or flyers or meeting minutes. We had that on there, and it just helped people recognize the project and what we were doing. Words gave us a website. Can you hear me without this thing? Okay. Pardon me? Okay, we'll work with it. It seems to be intermittent. Anyhow, every meeting was well advertised ahead of time. And then probably the biggest thing we did to promote participation in this is sat down with database on that database, and we didn't connect with everybody, but that promoted attendance. That's why I can't look over here. Here we go. Try this. You got to get going. Okay, so we had 10 meetings around the state, and this map shows where they were. We selected our spots carefully. They were all where there is a large number of irrigated acres. Sure. I don't know if it's me or the microphone. Might have to just hold this. Is this working? Okay. At each meeting, we would give an overview of the project. And then we had a series of talks on different types of funding opportunities. Chase would give a presentation on opportunities through the Water Development Office. Reclamation provided a pre-recorded presentation on WaterSmart and reclamation opportunities. The NRCS had a district conservationist at every meeting, and they would give a talk on EQIP and RCPP funding programs. And then one of our team would give a talk on some of the non-traditional methods, like some of the game and fish or Trout Unlimited or WWNRT type programs. This is what they looked like. They were pretty well attended. We think that they gave a very good venue for the ag community to feel heard. As with any meeting I've ever been involved with, most of that input comes after the meeting as you're taking down. Everybody wants to talk to you, but we made sure that we stuck around at every meeting until everybody that wanted to talk to us did. The most consistent concerns we heard was that the small guys had no benefit in participating in this. And that's just something we need to keep in mind going down the road. The big ones get a lot of attention and the small ones feel they don't have the opportunity. But it also helped identify some more structures, conduct site visits in association with these meetings. So the next step was to define what actually does criticality mean. We held a workshop last February where our whole team was present and Water Development Office's planners were there. And we all sat down and literally rolled up the sleeves and got to work. And we discussed, we brainstormed any kind of attributes that could be used in defining what's an important structure and to look at different ways of different strategies of prioritizing them. So we basically came down to the consensus was there was 3 main attributes that we could assign to every structure in the database we'd be building. First one is the service area. So how many acres would be affected if that structure were to fail? What type of structure it is. Some would have a greater impact than others. So we weren't concerned about measurement devices, but if a measurement device fails, you can keep operating. You just can't measure, but you could still have uninterrupted flow. Whereas if the diversion or the headgate failed, everything on that district is affected. And then finally, the existing condition. The worse the condition, the higher the score. So we came to agreement that the way we would rank these is called the RPI, the Rehabilitation Priority Index. Excuse me. It's been used on several projects before for the state master plans. It's very intuitive and it's been accepted and it makes sense. So there's 3 factors that go into it. The first one's called the Facilities Condition Index. Basically, the better the condition, the lower the ranking. The worse the condition, the more attention needs, so it gets a higher value. The middle column is the Structure Class Index. That's what I was just talking about, where certain structures have a greater impact if they are to fail. And then final one is the Asset Priority Index, where based upon the number of acres affected, you get a different score. So for each structure, you assign those 3 attributes, you add them up, that's your number, and you hit sort, and the big bad condition, highly disruptive structures rise to the top. So the database, this is the tool that we'll be taking forward into the future. So our task was to combine all that data that we pulled from the previous studies, all those databases. And the problem is the computer doesn't know if acres in one database equals acreage in another equals AC in a third. Every different consultant had a different way of assigning things, even among the same databases generated by the same consultant. There was variability. So pushing these all together was laborious. Try to give an example, a description of what that took. So now if you picture those blue shapes represent those 35 databases. Didn't have room for all of them on there. Everyone was different. And then we had the reclamation data, site visits. We conducted visits to about 48 or 49 individual structures in conjunction with the site visits while we were in the field. Public input, we got information at the public meetings, as well as using an app on our phones. It's called Survey 123, which integrates directly with the GIS on our servers at the office. The couple of conservation districts helped us out by going out and collecting field data. And so that information got incorporated into this database as well. Then there is the BIA in the state engineer's office. So we had to make these all identical. So we had to go through every database, every attribute that we were interested in, make sure everything was complete, make sure the nomenclature was consistent. Everything had to have a unique identifier. And then probably most importantly, we had to make sure that every structure had all three of the attributes we needed for our RPI. So the end now was all these individual databases that were identical. So we had a database for Goshen, a database for Midvale. Everyone had its own individual database. Once they were all set and identical and consistent, we pushed them all together into this one big giant master database. And then, of course, there's a QA/QC process. A lot of the data in this came from master plans that were 10 or 15 years old. And hopefully those districts have completed some of the recommendation then in those. So we circled back and reached out to all those districts and found out, what have you done? And so if a structure had been flagged in an initial database, master plan is failing, and they fixed it, we'd go back in and change that to now a good condition, and trying to make this as complete and comprehensive and up to date as we possibly could. So then we apply the RPI into the database and hit the sort button. So these are all the dots on the map that represent the final database. There was almost 11,000 structures in there. And keep in mind, I'm guessing maybe half of the total structures, because we're not counting measurement devices and farm turnouts, or I guess check structures are in there, but they're one of those structures. If they fail, it doesn't curtail delivery. But if you look at the orange and the red, about 18% or close to 2,000 of those are poor or failing. So that's what the point of this project has been about. If we drill into those two pieces of the pie, you can see that about 81% are serving less than 5,000 acres. Now that's either a smaller ditch or it's downstream in the distribution of a large district. But we're on the right side, about 154 are poor or failing or poor structures are serving over 25,000 acres. Those are the big ones that are going to cost more to work on, that are going to be harder to fix, that we need to pay some attention to. So this is what the top of the database looked like in a spreadsheet form. Because this information is not public yet, we don't want to be focusing attention on these big bad structures for security reasons, and we've redacted anything that identifies where they are. You can see here's our three columns. So this first structure was a siphon that because of it's a siphon, it had a score of 4.2. The asset is failing, so it had a 4, and the facilities condition is that's the failing. The asset priority is the number of acres. You add them up and it had the top score. So that's the first of two lists that we came up with. It's called the Irrigation Asset Priority Index. Okay. It's basically just a listing of all the structures in the state based upon that number, that RPI, a lot of acronyms here. So it has no concern yet about buildability or funding capabilities or permitting hurdles. There's no construction hurdles at all. It's just information for you as planners to know where the big liabilities lie. The next phase is called the Irrigation Rehab Plan, or the IRP, that brings some of these other attributes into consideration. We didn't resort the database with this new information. We basically kept it sorted as it was, so it still shows the big structures that have the most disruptive capability, but it's added all these other attributes onto it. Cost estimates. That's obviously a big one, and these aren't cheap structures. Collateral damage potential. By that, we mean what could happen to non-irrigation facilities should something fail. The canal perched on the road that I showed in the early photo, if it washed out, we all know it never happens at noon on a Tuesday. It's always 3 a.m. on a Sunday. It's dark. If it washed out that state highway, you could end up with a big gully, and obviously there could be some pretty bad things happening. Permitting can be a huge hurdle depending upon what we're dealing with. A headgate within an irrigation district, minimal permitting, but a diversion on a river, more. We flagged the conservation or environmental improvement potential in a structure because that can have a play in some of the funding opportunities. And on down the road, just some more information, number of users, cost per acre, and shovel readiness. So this is what it looks like. The colors don't show on this screen, but there are those top 10 structures again with the those other attributes filled in. And if something was positive, it's green, and if it was a negative or something significant, it was red. So costs, the top 10 structures in this list were totaling over $112 million, but that includes the GID tunnels. We kept them in because they're not done yet and it's still money's in the work. So we kept it in there to keep things simple. And for the top 31, back up, we found a natural break in the big database, the IAP, that ranks them just on the size and nature of the structure. We found a break when we ranked them. Above that break, they were large, critical style structures. At that break or below, it pretty much was a very consistent ranking, and it's hard to differentiate them from that point down. So we couldn't assign all those attributes to all the 2,000 poor and failing. So we did it in the cost estimates for the top 31. We're calling them the priority structures. They're close to 200 million. So of course they do include the GID tunnels and Midvale's liner. So we presented a discussion of some of the funding opportunities, and for each of those, and I'm not going to run through here, but you're familiar with most of them. And for each of those top priority structures, we flagged which of these programs might be the best way to go, what strategy to go forward with. So to kind of wrap up this talk, the IAP, the irrigation asset priority, am I getting that right again? No, sorry. The big database. It's a listing of all the structures with the greatest potential for disruption. The IRP brings in the attributes that help planners make decisions. As far as some recommendations, we think you've got now a great tool to take forward into the future. It was built primarily from a lot of the master plans. That's the lion's share of data in there. And just should be aware that having talked to all these districts, and my experience with them is the master plans are very highly valued, and we recommend they keep being funded. I know there's several in the works right now. Some are updates to older master plans, and they provide a valuable resource to these districts to help prioritize where they're going. Many of the structures in our priority list are within districts that are either in districts being studied now with last year's selection process. So those should have some attention paid to them as part of those projects. And a lot of them are on the ones that are coming up next year that I guess you'll be talking about tomorrow. We recommend updating the scope of these master plans to give attention to the structures that are in the critical aging database. And that would incorporate consistency within the database to enable it to be dynamic and updated easily. Then the GIS templates that have been developed a few years ago. Most of these projects, these databases we were dealing with, were developed after that was created. That's why it was a lot of labor to push them all together. But with some minor revisions to that template, it would make life easier for the Water Development Office to maintain it going down the road. And obviously there's ways that we can optimize funding by using state dollars as leverage against other entities, against federal or non-governmental organizations, Trout Unlimited. As matching funds, we can get more bang for the buck out of state dollars. Something to consider too is we don't know as consultants where you'll go with funding decisions. But if you're looking at, it might make sense to fund more structures that are smaller in lieu of one that's big. You might be able to get more bang for the buck out of funding a bunch of small ones that might sum total more acres than that single large one. The other thing to keep in mind is this is all sponsor driven. We can't make that number one structure entity come forward and do it. We're going to have to encourage, there's going to have to be incentives to get them to come to the table and participate. We'd also recommended some more site visits and some additional investigations, basically a level 2 before any of these structures go to being funded. And then finally, just the irrigation survey could be revised to facilitate collecting more structure specific information. Some of the sites we found out were connecting with one of these entities on the phone, and they'd say, well, I've got a drop structure 3.5 miles downstream of Cherry Creek. We can add that in here with that type of information. So that could be accomplished with the survey. So just to summarize, we now have a tool that's taken a lot of work, and it's got nearly 11,000 structures in it. You got a great tool. I don't think it exists anywhere else. There's conceptual cost estimates for the priority projects. We've got a lot of information in there to facilitate informed decision making. We have a defined prioritization strategy that works and is consistent, and that could be used on other projects down the road. It's basically a tool that can take us well into the future. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Questions?
Hey, I also think, is there a Justin online as well?
Pardon me?
Is there a Justin
Yeah,
online?
Justin Trefer
Yeah.
with
Justin
WWC.
Trefer with WWC is online. He's got a lot of good input on funding capabilities.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, just a comment. Having attended some of the meetings with some of the finance here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too would like to thank you for the survey. I think it's very helpful and a step in the right direction. When will it be available to, where we can actually start utilizing information in it?
Want to answer about the publicly available?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz, I think when we had all these public outreach meetings, we were very sensitive to the information that we were looking into. So we want to be respectful of the different districts that participated. We don't want to, everybody's laundry to everyone else. And because of the sensitive nature, we want to be careful with the information. So I think we're still considering how that's going to go out to the public. If it's going to be a redacted, kind of like we're seeing here, where you've got the bulk of the information on what went into the report, how we went through and prioritized things. But the actual specific project names would probably be redacted. So I would say, I don't remember exactly what the schedule is for the final report.
At the end of the year.
Yeah.
Probably gonna be
We'll pass that.
beyond that.
Yeah. Mhm.
Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess one question I would have going forward with this information that's now been kind of gathered. What were your thoughts as you looked over our situation that we face as a state right now? Maintenance versus replacement. Are you able to use this information now to say, well, you're at a point in your structures here based on what we're seeing, and when you qualify based on your fitting into this matrix, you need to be working on this now because it's going to cost us much less to work on this right now than if you give her another 10 years and then we're going to be fixing this whole thing again. Will that help us to be able to look at some of these structures going forward and start to reach out to some of these communities saying, guys, best money spent is right now. Your machine's running, but if you don't start changing the oil in it, it's going to be dead. How can you use this? And is that a possibility in this system that you created to bring that kind of a value add to it?
That's a great question. And I understand it totally because we face that as consultants doing these master plans. One of the first concerns is what I brought up, that this is all sponsor driven. So we can't tell someone to go out and fix your diversion because it's going to fail. As you know, it's going to cost, it's still going to cost them some money. So we've got to have some kind of incentives to make it attractive for them to go forward. And I think that as far as the answering the part of your question that was getting at the rehab versus replace and change the oil now, these master plans focus very specifically on that. In our project, we were pulling information from those master plans. We assumed it was the best available information, and because we couldn't go out and look at every one of those structures. If the master plan, and there's a whole slew of it being worked on right now. There's like 10 or 12 that are being completed now in some of the bigger districts. I think it's going to answer the question with attention to this, that, who needs an oil change now to get on it. But I think there's got to be, from my standpoint, looking at this now with all this information, some way to get them to come forward and participate. Thinking some level 2 type of inventory of these structures. I'm kind of referring to them as orphans. A lot of these in the top part of this list are included in the Goshen master plans being updated. Midvale's next year if it's funded. Cade is happening right now. If those structures are addressed now, that's essentially the site-specific information that we're going to need to determine whether it needs repair or replace.
Mr. Chairman, I would just add on to that too. I think our office has a role in this in continuing to follow up with these sponsors that didn't respond necessarily as quickly as we would like to have in this study to, help them understand, hey, you are in that top 31 or you've got a structure that's failing. What are your plans into the future? Let them know, hey, we have a program here that can help you address these things, talk to them about federal funding and try to get those, get an idea of what districts are doing to address their issues. And if it makes sense, like on an efficiency type basis, rather than going out and looking at these piecemeal and individual level 2 studies, maybe we have something that a level 2 study that focuses on the, northeast part of Wyoming or something and goes out and looks at 6 or 8 of these in a level 2 study to get them to the point where we can have good dollar or estimates for construction and pare these down to where we're not doing an individual level 2 study for each individual structure. And then I think, one of the biggest reasons we started talking about this was obviously the tunnels and LaPrelle is what started the conversation. But then just understanding, the decision makers, folks like you in the legislature, and being able to tell a story. Hey, we've done this study, just looking at the 31 sites out of 11,000, we've got $200 million of need, and understanding what our program can do to, so everybody can start understanding the situation. And like Jay already mentioned, we have several master plans in the works now and several more that might get funded in the next several days. And that alone might check off about half the list of the top 31 and being able to get more specific information on those. So
Representative, did that answer your question?
One follow-up, sir. I appreciate that, Jason, and that's what I was trying to get at is how can we, because I hear it on the floor when we're discussing water and the need to put more money into this infrastructure and stuff, and I think it would help us to give a better argument for the idea, well, we're trying to be more proactive in how we apply these dollars, that fewer these dollars can go farther and do more good long term when we're trying to address things before they get to be a real problem. And we're trying to figure out how we can help these different districts evaluate their situation, and a few dollars spent now on maintenance can save millions of dollars potentially down the road because people are unwilling or don't think it's really that big of a deal. But when you can start to assess, the critical nature of each one of these pieces of equipment and say, right now is the ideal, best, most efficient time to invest a few dollars to make this thing last a long time. From your department standpoint, that would be incredibly valuable to us as a state because we can start making those dollars go farther and keep more of this operating instead of waiting for something to tragically happen and then show up with a huge, obligation that is not fun to try to expect anybody to come up with money for. If we're going along doing a good job of keeping things going in the right direction, I think people would be much more amenable to putting dollars into this if they know it's going to be preventing rather than fixing. And so
The other thing sorry, Mr. Chairman, we had a couple of tasks within Tri-Hydro's scope of work. One was to develop a phase 2 scope of work of what do we do from here? And that was going to initially, I think the thought was more boots on the ground, go out and do these level 2 studies and come up with a scope and what that might cost. And I don't know the appetite for that, if we want to do that at this point or not. The other one was we had a discretionary task in case we found some structures that absolutely needed to be addressed right now. We could go out and do, get a structural engineer out there, for example, and understand what do we need to do right now to get this structure taken care of. I don't think we found anything like that. So we do have some funding left in their contract. One thought we had was we've got cost estimates on the top 31. What can we do? Is it a fairly easy process to take some of these ones that we looked at from previous master plans that might be 11 years old or 5 years old and try to apply some inflationary factors to understand, maybe what the top 50 would cost or the top 100? Or do we want to let that money revert, do what we kind of talked about, do some outreach, figure out what the next steps are, incorporate some of this stuff into our irrigation system surveys to get more feedback on structures as well. I don't know, general discussion about the appetite. We have what we want. This is good for now, or we want to take this further. We want to redirect some of the existing dollars that they have scoped that we probably wouldn't move forward with. Like I said, scoping out a phase 2. Do we want to do that? Do we want to take some of the discretionary tasks and utilize it for something else to get a little further down the road? So if there's any thoughts on that.
Has a question.
You, Mr. Chairman, some comments and then a question. So I think this gets us a long way down the road because every single one of us at this dais, we're policymakers. We're handling public funds and we're trying to make them stretch as far as we can. And we can't really make accurate decisions without knowing our liabilities. And so there are some things in the state budget that are wants, but these are all needs because this is the backbone of our communities, of our food sources, of our recreational opportunities, all of that. So I think it's really important. There's another point I'd like to make. That picture of the tunnel made it look really nice and like it really is doing pretty well. I just want to remind everyone above that metal sheeting, there's a gaping hole that's about to collapse in that tunnel. So in my way of thinking, it's still more of an emergency situation than a just take your time repair. So, but with going back to the GID tunnel and the fact that the Bureau of Reclamation still holds title on that facility, do we have a way of gauging how many of those facilities are Bureau of Reclamation facilities still? And then also, could this be utilized as a tool to make our case that we might need some help from them as far as some of these projects and the ability of irrigators and other people to pay for those. Thank you.
No. I don't know, but I think we could figure that out because they're in the district. And yes, you were there when I took that picture. So yes, there is a gaping hole there. You're right.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, just a question about after the evaluation process, when you identify, say, a critical failing piece of infrastructure, it rates in the very top of your list. Do you send out letters of notification to those said districts, telling them, explaining to them what you found in your evaluations, so they could then, I guess, act upon that or make other requests? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, we have not done that. I think that's probably a good idea. It is to notify those folks, at least a phone call. I don't know if it needs to be an official letter, but to make contact with those folks and let them know where that ranked out, and again, follow up, see what they're doing about it.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think it's critically important to send, probably do both, first, call them up and have a conversation, but send written notice to them stating what your findings are. So we don't get any confusion in the future of, maybe you don't get to the right people. I don't know, but I think we have to do everything possible to alert them of what your findings are, so they can be better prepared to maybe put forth a proposal to repair said issues. So anyway, that was my question to you. Do you think that's a good idea, that maybe take a multiple pronged approach to this for notification? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I do think that's a good idea. I'd like to hear from the commission as well and understand if you guys think it's a good idea, and the rest of the legislators.
I don't plan to sit on the shelf. Not now. We have great inventory. We started a plan on the shelf. Of course, I like the idea of two studies for a quadrant, and I know what gets left behind. So that's my comment.
Any other comments? Collect water.
Sir, just one other question.
Commissioner.
Did it? But then I don't know if there's some way to follow up to at least fix it.
Mr. Chairman, I would like, I guess, a short discussion to provide our office the latitude to talk with Tri-Hydro on figuring out what extra effort, if any, what might take to get a little further down the road on at least these reconnaissance level cost estimates, maybe to the top 50 or the top 100 sites, just so we have a better understanding of not just the top 31. And if it's within a reasonable, range, or we can't get it for free, that we might be able to use some of that phase 2 task that would have developed that additional scope to that, maybe just use some of that, get some of these cost estimates. Is there any heartburn over that?
Well, no heartburn specifically to that question, but on the broader question of where we go. And to pick up where Senator Kolb, I think, were those who participated, and we've identified a contract or a structure. We need to provide them a copy of the report. Other than that, I think that's as far as this could go, because this is a sponsor-driven program. And when somebody has been notified that they have a structure that is in poor shape or failing, it is incumbent upon them to come and then put an application in and go through the process. And so to spend more money to go out and design something when we have no application from that legal entity to do that, And any commitment for them to follow up seems to me like we're just wasting money. And so I would put the burden back on the responsibility of the owners of those structures to say, you've been notified and we may want to do something, as my colleague to the right suggested, and say, oh, by the way, you have a very poor failing structure. You need to do something about that. But if you choose not to, which there will be some that choose not to for a multitude of reasons, political, social, economic, for whatever reason, makeup of the board, there's a whole reasons that they may not act on that. They should be notified that they won't be eligible for full funding through the Water Development Commission when there is a complete failure. You need to do your routine maintenance, folks. Just don't want to continue to shift the burden onto the program at the expense of other users that have done routine maintenance for somebody that chooses to make a cognizant decision not to maintain their infrastructure. So that would be, I guess my recommendation is provide notification. Notify them as part of that the program's available and applications would be considered. And that now that we have an assessment of that structure, if they choose not to in future, if it's determined that lack of maintenance, which is already in the criteria, if it's determined lack of maintenance is the reason for failure, you're not eligible for the program. So I think just reiterating those criteria as part of that notification would be beneficial. That's just my thoughts.
Speaker, you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I agree with Senator Hicks. I'm not going to say that there's poor maintenance. I think if you looked at that bar chart that showed how old some of the structures were, it's far beyond maintenance on some things, and I think that's a piece of information that's good for all of the legislature to see. If you see nothing else in this whole piece that you provided, it's that bar chart on the age of the infrastructure out there. And in cement, there's what is it? There's cement that will crack and has cracked. And and that's I think kind of what happens after 80 to 90 years. And so I think that piece of information is important to get to the legislature. I think it's also important to get back to those producers. What is the likelihood of that structure failing? If in that report you have, okay, this is an 80-year-old structure, and our assessment says XYZ, and you should do a red flag when there's a red flag needed to that producer, so he understands that he needs to maybe get with it. But no, I agree. I think I don't think we spend money until if a producer, there's plenty of money we can spend money on a lot of things in the state. People are going to come and ask for it. We don't need to just do it.
Well, the other part of the puzzle too, then, is most of our projects and our costs were assuming replacement. And every district in the state knows sometimes you can fix something without replacing it for a lot cheaper. So these are conservatively high, if anything. So that's why we're advocating a level 2, whether it's in concurrent with an existing master plan or upcoming plan, to give attention to that, to make the decision. Yes, we can fix this one if we replace this wing wall or something like that. But that's just going to be added information. And like Jason talked about doing a level 2 with quadrants, you might consider also pulling the ones that are in current master plans out of the mix, because they're going to get looked at. And the ones I'm referring to as orphans are the ones that are the individual canal company, and working with them that are currently even not a district, but they need to be to go forward. So it's all part of the puzzle.
That's
Mr. Chairman, could we take a short break? We're having a little bit of difficulty with the PBS feed, and they might want to readjust where they are with that pillar over there. Might be causing a problem. So Maybe a 5 to
10
10
minutes?
minute break, 10 minutes?
Yeah, let's do a
Sure.
10-minute break.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Director, I think we're ready to move on to the next agenda item.
The next agenda item, we're going to get into cloud seeding and the program that Julie Gonzar with the Water Development Office administers. I'm going to hand it over to Julie to give you a little update or refresher, I guess, on cloud seeding, and then that'll end up going into another presentation here in a second.
Julie, before you start, I'm going to remind everybody that when you're wanting to talk, you press the button. And then after you're done talking, please shut it back off. When we get too many microphones going, it affects things. So appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Director, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present about our most recent cloud seeding study. I will apologize for the quality of my voice. I have a daughter in preschool now, so she's bringing home some illnesses every once in a while, so this might be a trend, but I will do my best with enunciating. So you are about to hear from our consultants at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and their findings on our most recent cloud seeding study, which was a hydrological assessment study on our aerial cloud seeding program. But first, before I introduce them, we thought it was important for me to come up here and take about 10 or 15 minutes to go over our cloud seeding program and our aerial cloud seeding program just in general, to remind everybody about what we do with cloud seeding in the state. And that will lead right into the results presentation that Sarah is going to lead. Oh.
We wanted to make sure that we recorded the presentation just in case the questions came up during the session. We could point people towards a link they could go watch it. Because I know there were some folks last session that weren't. Oh, we're good. Okay. All right. Sorry for the interruption. I don't know that you've gotten.
Okay, so I always like to start big picture. And I apologize if there's a way to move that little camera screen off to the right, that might be helpful for this particular slide. This is basically big picture of wintertime cloud seeding programs across the Western United States. For purposes of what we're talking about for today, winter cloud seeding, you're just going to want to pay attention to the areas in blue. The areas in green are warm season cloud seeding, which we do not do in the state of Wyoming. The point of this slide is really to show a multi-state effort across a lot of the Western states and wintertime cloud seeding. Idaho, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming have had long established programs. There have been other states that recently have a lot of interest in cloud seeding, especially with the issues going on in the Colorado River Basin, of course. Idaho and Utah in particular have had some additional funding come into their state, specifically for aerial cloud seeding. So that's really exciting for them. And we've had some renewed interest from our federal partners, particularly the Bureau of Reclamation. You may have heard, I believe it was back in August when it was announced that the Bureau has given a grant of $2.4 million to the 3 upper basin states for that money to be split for enhancing cloud seeding operations. So that's really exciting. That is in the works right now between the Bureau, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. So there's some exciting things that are happening in the world of cloud seeding.
Thank you. If we go back to that last map, if you were to look at that, how much of that is associated with ski areas trying to enhance their snow versus, and maybe you have a later slide, versus states just trying to enhance, or other entities trying to enhance the water?
My best answer to that question is that I know that the state of Colorado has had funding agreements in the past with ski resorts. That funding, I think, has been very off and on since COVID. So I'm not 100% sure what the ratio is for the state of Colorado between ski resort funding and state funding. I know it's gone down a little bit over the past few years. As far as Utah, I am not sure on their contribution from ski. So just taking a brief overview of Wyoming's program, we've been involved in cloud seeding, whether it was research or operations, for almost 20 years now. And this slide shows that the focus since the early 2000s was really focused on research and feasibility and design studies, looking at whether or not cloud seeding would be a viable technology for the state. Starting around 2014, the research and feasibility studies kind of tapered off, and we jumped right into operations. And so we've been operating 2 cloud seeding programs now during that time frame. Our ground-based program has been operated the longest. We have 12 ground-based generators with benefit to the upper Colorado River Basin, and 1 aircraft since 2018 operating to benefit the North Platte and the Little Snake River Basins. So the presentation that you'll hear from Sarah and NCAR focuses on our aerial program. And so here's just an overall map of the state of Wyoming. And you'll see here 2 big project areas. So on the western side of the state, where you see the picture of the ground-based generator, that's our ground-based program targeting the Wind River Range, and 2 generators on the west slope of the Sierra Madre Mountains, targeting the upper Colorado. Our aerial program targets the North Platte River Basin and the Little Snake, with these 3 target areas across the southeast part of the state. And we have had a partnership since the beginning of our aerial program with the Jackson County Water Conservancy District in Walden, Colorado. Our relationship with them is very much a phase 2 of this cloud seeding project. Wyoming mountain ranges have priority number 1. Of course, there is benefit to Wyoming when we seed in Jackson County, but because it's a phase 2 of the project, they're a priority number 2 when and if there's an opportunity.
I apologize. Is it possible to receive the presentation? I did not receive it, and I apologize for that.
This presentation?
Yes.
I didn't. Anybody has a copy?
I think it'd be advantageous if we could all receive that.
Yes, absolutely. I can make it in PDF form if that's easy, and if everybody is okay with it, we can share this presentation for sure.
Thank you.
Yep. And this is short, so if there's any other details that you want, just let us know. Okay, so what's cool about our program is that there's generally 2 main methods of seeding, and we employ both of them, ground-based and aircraft. So we're really lucky to be one of the few states that does both. Our ground-based programs in the western part of the state, and then as I just mentioned, our aircraft program is on the southeast part of the state. Just have a couple other pictures here to show you. On an aircraft, there are burn-in-place flares on each of the wings, and then ejectable flares, so two different types of flares that you'll see here that are located on the belly of the aircraft. And then our ground-based generators basically just look like a small meteorological tower. Okay, then this is just another perspective of the state and generally where our target areas are for the programs, in which we've overlaid the river basins here. And then again, for the study coming up that NCAR is going to share, we're focusing on this target area, the Sierra Madres and the Medicine Bow Mountains. So that's our aerial program. Okay, so I mentioned before our 3 mountain ranges, priority 1, Medicine Bow and the Sierra Madre Mountain. The Never Summer Mountain Range in Jackson County was a priority 2 during the time frame of the study. We have 1 aircraft, and we've always had 1 aircraft with our aerial program. And so it really has a large responsibility to manage those 3 target areas. The season that we seed in the wintertime is generally early November through mid-April. And we just started our season this year about 6 days ago, November 1st, and that will go through April 15th. So this graphic you'll see again in Sarah's presentation, but I wanted to show you again the river basins and the area of study in which this assessment really focuses on. So you'll see the Little Snake here and the North Platte River Basin here. The blue lines, which you may not see as blue if you're looking on the screen, but the blue lines overlay the mountain ranges, and they represent suggested flight tracks based on wind direction and wind speed of winter storms if there is a seeding opportunity. One thing just to make a note, if you're already asking a question about it, is in any area where you see that the flight tracks are outside of the river basin target area, it's just accounting for the aircraft flying outside of the boundary in order to account for high winds, so not to overshoot the target area. Just had to say that little disclaimer there in case that's a question. Okay, so how long have we been doing aerial seeding? Our first aerial seeding operations began in the winter of 2018, and we've been operating this program. This was a little bit of extra money after we did a feasibility study that was approved to conduct operations. So it was really great to get started this year. And then we've been able to do our annual operations all the way through the present. During this time between 2018 and 2022, our agency was pretty consistently approached regarding further assessment of our program. We've had cloud seeding studies done before, but they've always been prior to operations and never really looking at anything coming from actual operations. So this is why this study is really exciting. Okay. So why do a hydrological assessment study? There were some big questions that we were getting asked that needed to be answered. Is aerial cloud seeding cost effective? What's the cost benefit to doing this now that we've had 4 or 5 years of annual operations? And can we and let's integrate data from actual operations to help answer these questions? So you may remember 2022 legislative session on the omnibus planning bill. There was a project recommendation for aerial operations hydrological assessment for the Medicine Bow and the Sierra Madre mountain ranges. And that went through and passed, and we got the funding for that. And then we did the consultant selection process in the summer of 2022. So the goals of this study, there's really three main goals. Assess precipitation and stream flow impacts resulting from actual aerial cloud seeding over our 2 target areas in the state, quantify additional stream flow in acre feet within those basins, and provide a cost benefit analysis. So we looked at.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just quickly. So for example, on the on the Wind River Mountains, you try to also track, because obviously snow flows both ways off of those mountains as it does on any mountain. You've got a hydrologic divide. So are you trying to see, for example, are you hitting your target, or are you flopping over onto the other side of the mountain perhaps, and it becomes the larger target? Have you done any work to figure out in other basins that are directly adjacent or on the mountain, same mountain?
That's a great question. And we did a study for the Medicine Bow and the Sierra Madre. It was a siting and design study where that was looked into, looking at, are we reaching our target area? But that was not based off of actual operations. That was very research boundaries. For the Wind River Mountains, our pilot study, which was 10 years between 2015, trying to jog my memory about that one. I believe that we did look at that. Sarah can speak to that question also, and she'll probably bring that up a little bit when she talks about this assessment study and how they looked at those things. So if your question is not answered in my presentation, please make sure to ask it again. Okay, so we looked at all 4 seasons based on, I'll go back here just a minute. Between 2018 and 2022 winter seasons, we looked at all 4 seasons, but one season was selected for a more intensive assessment. And that will be addressed, why we did that, and how we chose this one season in Sarah's presentation. I just want to lead in with that a little bit. So really, NCAR in Boulder and Sarah Tessendorf, who's here to do this presentation, she has worked with our agency for many, many years, since the pilot study, or maybe even, since the pilot study, before I was even here. And she's really done a lot of great work with our agency. NCAR has state-of-the-art tools and cutting-edge technology to look at this kind of thing. So we were really happy to work with them. The University of Wyoming was a sub-consultant on this project, and we were very excited about that. Obviously, we have a long history with the University of Wyoming, and they played a part in this project as well. And really, this type of assessment has never really been done before with an operational program. It's done before with a research program, but not an operational program. So this is really cutting edge, state-of-the-art stuff. As an agency, we really do like to look at our own work and analyze our own program to make sure that we're doing things that are cost effective and that we're using the state's money in a wise way. So that was one of the motivations for, asking for funding to do this project. We're excited to be working with NCAR for a state-of-the-art evaluation. We've had great experience with them. And one other thing I wanted to emphasize is that there's been a significant amount of effort that has gone into this project. It really is not easy to look at all of the variables and the complexity of atmospheric science and how it relates and how to assess the impacts of a cloud seeding program. And with that, I am going to welcome Sarah Tessendorf. She is all queued up with her presentation.
Have to share my screen.
You just have to share your screen, and you probably, if you want them.
I might. Thank you. All right. Well, that worked. Technology doesn't always work so well, but we can be thankful for that today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commission and Select Water for being here and inviting me to come speak on these results. I'm really excited to share the results of this study. It's been long anticipated since Julie made mention of the pilot program. I just also want to acknowledge that a lot of the advances in this area of science really started coming back around with that initial investment that the state of Wyoming made in launching that research study, the Wyoming Weather Modification Pilot Program. Since then, there have been a lot of new advances, and I still want to attribute a lot of that to the foundational research study that was done back starting in the early 2000s that Julie mentioned. So my name is Dr. Sarah Tessendorf. I'm going to be speaking along with Dr. Erin Doherty, who's online, on our results of this study on evaluating the precipitation and stream flow impacts in the Medicine Bow and Sierra Madre mountain ranges. But I also want to acknowledge all of the team at NCAR and the University of Wyoming that contributed to this study. Dave Gochis, Michelle Harold, Jamie Wolf, and Lulin Shua from NCAR, and Professor Bart Geertz and Al Rody from the University of Wyoming all contributed in many ways to this project. We also want to acknowledge the supercomputer that was used for this computationally expensive study was the Cheyenne supercomputer hosted by the NCAR Wyoming Supercomputing Center. And before I go on, I want to minimize what's showing up on my screen here. There we go. All right, so for a high-level project overview, our goal here is to quantify the impacts of aerial cloud seeding over the Medicine Bow and Sierra Madre mountain ranges, as well as the subsequent impacts on stream flow to the North Platte and Little Snake River basins. As Julie showed in her presentation, we've got the map here showing the region that we focused on in this study. The black thick outlines are showing those two river basins that were the focus of quantifying the stream flow impacts, as well as you can see those flight tracks for the three areas that were targeted with the aerial cloud seeding. To do this study, we're using state-of-the-art NCAR computer models to do two things. The first step in this study was to develop the method to evaluate the impacts of cloud seeding on precipitation and on stream flow. So really setting up these modeling tools, calibrating them, making sure that we have a robust system to use for this evaluation, and then demonstrating this for one season of the aerial cloud seeding operations to quantify those impacts on precipitation and stream flow. So before I jump into it, just in case not everyone is familiar with the concept of how cloud seeding works, I have a diagram here that walks you through. There's 5 key steps in cloud seeding wintertime storms over the mountains. The first step is that you have a cloud forming. Cloud seeding does not create clouds, so we need an existing cloud to be present. The clouds forming over the mountains generally form because the air is blowing up and over the mountain. That's forming the cloud. That cloud needs to contain supercooled liquid water, which means water that's in liquid form at temperatures colder than the freezing point. This does happen in nature. Not all liquid water freezes immediately when it gets colder than 32 degrees Fahrenheit because it needs little particles in there in order for it to freeze onto. So that's where cloud seeding can come in, because sometimes nature doesn't produce enough of those particles, or the temperature that those particles produce ice is much colder than what silver iodide can do. So silver iodide is the type of seeding agent that's typically used. You can release that from a ground-based generator, as Julie had shown a picture of, or from an aircraft. The aircraft has some advantages because you can release the material directly in the cloud or right above the cloud, whereas the ground-based generator, you have to have the airflow get it up into the cloud. And so that's why step 3 is actually really important to how well cloud seeding is going to work also, is that that material has to disperse and reach the targeted cloud. Once it gets into the cloud at appropriate temperatures, that silver iodide nucleates ice. That's step 4. And once the ice forms in these clouds, the snow can rapidly grow at the expense of that supercooled liquid water in the cloud. So in other words, seeding is just converting some of the extra cloud water that's in the cloud into additional snowfall. So that's the overall physics behind the cloud seeding principles. So one of the state-of-the-art components that we're using for this evaluation is a computer model that we developed at NCAR. We call it WRF Weather Mod. It is a weather forecast model that has a special module in it that simulates the physics of silver iodide seeding. So all of those steps in the conceptual model that I just walked you through are being simulated now in this model. This animation serves to help illustrate how the model works. So here we have, in this case, an example simulation over the Sierra Madre and Mudbow. This is not one of the actual cases from the operations, but just for an example, you can see the clouds in white over these mountain ranges. We can insert the silver iodide in this animation. It'll be inserted at an aircraft flight altitude here, and cyan. There's this yellow color embedded in that, which is the ice crystals forming. And then the green that falls below that is the snow. You'll see a lot of other regions where the snow is forming too. This is a weather forecast model that is designed to simulate and forecast natural snowfall as well. But the benefit of using a model like this, and this model was only recently developed in the last 10 years, the benefit of this is we can run a controlled experiment. So we can run a simulation with the seeding, as shown in this animation. We can run the exact same case without seeding and look at the differences. We can map out the differences spatially as well as quantify those amounts. That's a huge transformation in this field of trying to evaluate cloud seeding impacts. Cloud seeding has been around for 75 years, but we haven't gotten to this point to have supercomputers and sophisticated models like we have today until the last decade or so. I gotta stop thinking that this is my advance. All right. So another major advance that took place in the last 5 or 6 years was a field program that came again out, kind of grew out of the Wyoming pilot program. This program was called SNOWY, which was an acronym, stood for Seeded in Natural Orographic Wintertime Clouds, the Idaho Experiment.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I've had too much caffeine now. So the question is, the thing with all models, right, is junk in, junk out, good stuff in, good stuff out. So was the model based upon the earlier study work that then I guess what's the basis behind that model that you believe now you have probably a good model that indicates something other than just retread faster?
Thank you. You beat me to the punch on that one. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker, we have been developing this model over the past 10 years, and these results that I'm about to show are some of how we're evaluating and improving that model. And I'll show you a few more results of how we're comparing the model with observations that are available to see how well it's doing, because you are exactly right, models have uncertainty. So I just said that they're a very new and novel way to evaluate cloud seeding, but they're still not the ultimate silver bullet. There's uncertainty there, and there's some additional methods that we're applying here to help quantify that uncertainty that I'll walk you through. So in the SNOWY program, a big breakthrough. So we went into the field, we wanted to collect these in situ measurements in the clouds in order to improve and validate the WRF weather model, but also to better understand and quantify the impacts of cloud seeding. And what we did is we focused on aerial cloud seeding, that when an aircraft is flying back and forth along a straight line track, like in this case here, the yellow track, actually, maybe I'll use the pointer, the yellow track that you'll see in this animation, it'll show up again, is the actual aircraft track. If your eyes are really good, you might see the orange dot going back and forth. That's the actual aircraft location. So in this case, the winds are from the southwest. So our flight tracks are generally perpendicular to the winds. And as it flies back and forth, releasing silver iodide, that silver iodide disperses downwind in a zigzag-like pattern. And Mother Nature does not produce zigzag patterns. Mother Nature can produce linear storms, but this zigzag pattern is very clear, unambiguous evidence that that is due to seeding. So this is a radar animation of radar reflectivity. Prior to the seeding, there's not really, and here it's starting, you don't really have any radar reflectivity on the map. So there's the cloud hanging out, but not effectively producing snow. Once we start seeding, it's producing ice and snow that you see in that zigzag-like pattern. Very clear evidence that proves the entire conceptual model of cloud seeding. We observed this in multiple cases during SNOWY. We've been doing a lot of research, but this is one, proves the conceptual model. Two, shows us that in some cases with radar data, we can actually see this pattern as another way to detect the effects of cloud seeding. So moving forward a few years, when Wyoming launches the aerial cloud seeding program, We now know maybe we should be looking for zigzags in the radar data to show that there's seeding effects happening in these clouds. Now, I will caveat this with the radar networks that are out there, the NexRad networks, don't always see over the mountains very well because the mountains themselves block the signal. So in the Medicimbo and Sierra Madre ranges here, they're just outside of the visible area from the Cheyenne NexRad most of the time. But on the east slope of the Medicimbo, you do get some coverage from the Cheyenne NexRad. So that's how we were able to see in this example case here, and you'll see it, it's a pretty fast moving animation, but there's a squiggly zigzag that shows up right about now inside this box, just downwind of where the aerial seeding was taking place in the Medicimbo range. So we now have also observed this zigzag in other places, such as in this aerial program from Wyoming. And what this does for us too, is it provides us additional good cases to verify that model, going back to the speaker's question about, you know, how are we comparing how good our model can actually represent the reality of these cases? There we go. All right, so we did utilize this case as we started this study. We wanted to simulate it with the model and see how well can the model represent what was observed by the Cheyenne radar. So here's a snapshot of the zigzag pattern from the radar. Here's a simulation without seeding. And then here's the simulation with seeding where you can see the zigzaggy kind of pattern showing up in the simulated reflectivity. So we compared the snowfall rates from the radar in this case with our model as one way of showing that the model can represent this case adequately. Another thing that we are doing with this study that is really important to address the uncertainties that models do have in them is we designed an ensemble modeling approach to try to quantify the uncertainty by creating a range of possible solutions rather than a single solution. So in this graphic up here, you can see a forecast over time with a single forecast simulation. We call this a deterministic forecast. It gives you one answer. And say your observation was what is shown here by the X. So you've got some error in that forecast. That's to be expected. Models will have some uncertainty and error. But what we can do is we can run the model multiple times, varying very different things with the initial conditions or how the model is set up to get then a range of possible solutions. And what we see when we run these ensembles of model simulations is that, one, we can better encompass the observations then and try to capture some of that forecast and simulation model uncertainty. So that's the approach that we took here as well, where we constructed a model ensemble in order to provide a range of solutions for that single aerial cloud seeding season. The season that we selected had 27 seeding cases in it, and our ensemble that we designed throughout this study included 36 different model configurations. So to conduct this study, we ran around 1,000 model simulations to be able to capture the uncertainty and estimate the impacts of cloud seeding in that season. And then another thing that was really important for us to do was utilize other observations that were available to compare with the model as well. So the seeding aircraft in this case flew with an instrument on board to measure liquid water content in the clouds. This is an image of that instrument. This is an image of the seeding aircraft. And what we did then, and this is an example for one seeding case, we show here the range. These are box and whisker plots. So they show the spread of measurements in gray. Here on the left, those are the measured values of liquid water content throughout the flight. And then in all of the other ones, we're seeing what each of those 36 model simulations predicted the liquid water content would be. Some of these model configurations compared very well. Not all of them did. This is the exact reason why we run an ensemble. We need that ensemble as a whole to be able to capture the observations when we understand that a single model simulation on its own may not always do that. But in doing this comparison, we were able to show that the ensemble as a whole was able to capture the observations adequately. So getting back to the selection of the season, I mentioned the season we selected had 27 cases in it. The reason we had to select one season, though, is because we were, first of all, developing and designing and testing this ensemble, as well as running so many simulations in order to get a fairly robust result. So we felt that as far as the scope of work, we needed to focus on one season for that intensive model analysis. To do that, we carefully went through the 4 seasons that were options. And one of those key things that we wanted to have available for the season that we selected were those aircraft observations of liquid water. That instrument was not on the aircraft in the first season, so that season was not going to be an ideal season to develop and demonstrate this method with. The other thing that we learned was the Mullen fire took place in the fall of 2020. As a result of that fire, some of the flight tracks were altered in order to avoid the burn scar, as well as the subsequent season. There were concerns that there might be lingering effects of the land surface change due to that fire. So results from that season might be a little bit anomalous was the concern. So we ended up choosing to do our intensive evaluation on the 2019-2020 winter season. And like I said, that season had 27 cases, which is pretty typical. Some of the other seasons had, in the low 20s. I think this fourth season had maybe 40 cases. So, in the 25 to 40 range is a pretty common number of cases. So 27 cases was kind of in the middle there. But I will make a point that now that we have gone through this initial evaluation and development calibration of this model-based system, if there are other seasons that would like to be investigated with that intensive approach, the system is ready and for use for that type of purpose. So as I mentioned, there were 27 seeding cases in this particular winter. This pie chart now shows a breakdown of the amount of time that was spent seeding in each of those three regions where flight tracks were flown. So the orange portion indicates that the majority of the seeding time was spent focused on the flight tracks in the Medicine Bow range. About a quarter of the time was spent on the flight tracks in the Sierra Madres, and the least amount of time was spent on these flight tracks down in the Never Summer Mountains in Jackson County. As Julie had mentioned, that was a secondary priority, so that one was not flown and seeded as much. So jumping right in now to the model results. So what we're looking at now are ensemble mean results. So remember, we ran the model multiple times. These are averages over all of those different possible solutions. On the left, we're looking at the total amount of precipitation that accumulated during the 27 seeding cases. And on the right, we're looking at the difference in precipitation between the seeded simulation and its control no seeding counterparts. So essentially, that's a map of the accumulated extra precipitation that fell due to seeding based on the ensemble mean. So you can see most of the seeding effect here showing up in the highest elevations of the Medicine Bow range. We have some also impacting the Sierra Madre, as well as some down here in the Never Summer. But on the next slide, I'm going to turn this into numbers of acre feet, and I'm going to be focusing in here on our two basins that were the focus of the study, the North Platte and the Little Snake. So this table here summarizes now in acre feet, the same thing that was being represented in those maps. So this is the total acre feet precipitation that accumulated during those seeding cases versus the additional amount of precipitation in acre feet. So for a combination of across the two basins, we had about 9,500 acre feet based on the ensemble mean. Now, remember though, with this ensemble, the ensemble mean represents the average of all of these solutions, but we can also look at the range of those solutions as well. And so we can look at that full spread. So here we're now looking at these results, and you can focus on this left one in the gray. That's the total ensemble spread of simulated seeding effect, for the minimum being down about 6,000 acre feet and the maximum up around 14,000 total acre feet. The colored bar charts here are just showing how each of those different ensemble member configurations makes up that total spread. So we have a total range, like I said, of 6,000 to 14,000 acre feet, with that mean being about 9,500 acre feet. And Erin has just turned on her camera, and I'm going to hand it over to her to walk you through the Wharf Hydro model analysis of the stream flow impacts.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for
Hang
having
on,
me.
Erin, a second. We have a question in the room.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, just a question about, I don't know how I'd phrase it. You can look at it two different ways, but percent accuracy is probably the most common one that people would understand. Your numbers are so tiny of the impact of that, of the precipitation, the increase in water. Just what is your percentage of certainty or uncertainty, however you want to say this, on your model's accuracy? Because the numbers are so small, the increase, it would seem, maybe a question to ask you as the one who developed all this. What type of confidence do you have in the accuracy of your models? I mean, where'd you start at? Where you're at now? Where do you think you can be? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator. That's a really great question. This is where it's very important for us to have as many types of observations as possible so that we can try to better quantify how good we think these model simulations are. The in situ measurements from that aircraft of liquid water content were available. Unfortunately, not the quality of those was not good in all the flights. So in about half of the flights, we can compare and we can quantify. The model simulated the amount of supercooled liquid water pretty reasonably. In those types of cases, I have a lot higher confidence that the output is going to be closer to what we might expect. In a case where the model simulates too much, or in some cases too little, which I do think that the model might be in some cases still producing too little supercooled liquid water, we might be underestimating the effects. But the overall magnitudes, so from the Snowy project that I showed you, that initial zigzag, we were able to quantify the amount of additional precipitation on the ground using radar and snow gauges, and it was on the order of 1 to 300 acre foot per case. Now, some cases might get seeded for longer periods of time, and over time you might accumulate more, but I think that and on our case by case simulations, we would get, on the order of several hundred acre feet up to maybe 1,000 or 1,500 acre foot per case. I think that ballpark, that order of magnitude is probably what's happening. We're not able to completely change the nature of a cloud and produce this downpour. Like, one common concern is cloud seeding going to lead to floods and, horrible hazards like that. We're not able, that amount of extra water is not so much to be able to transform the cloud to be a massive blizzard if it was just a modest cloud to begin with. So I think the numbers are in the right ballpark, but they still have some uncertainty to it. And the more observations that we have, the better that we can try to quantify what confidence we have in those.
Quick question, Mr. Chairman. So what's the average length of a seedable event?
Mr. Chairman and Mr.
And how do you use that to plug that into the model?
For an aerial event, the most seedable events are limited by the flight time. The actual conditions for seeding might be seedable for longer than that, but the flight time of the aircraft is usually the limiting factor, and that's on the order of 3 to 4 hours that will be seeded for. That's one advantage to ground-based seeding, is that you can seed for 6 to 8 to 12 hours, because some storms do have seedable conditions that might last 8, 12 hours or more. It will depend from storm to storm. But again, there's pros and cons to ground versus airborne, but that is one limitation of a single aircraft, is that they usually can only fly for 3 to 4 hours. Sometimes they can do back-to-back flights. If it is a prolonged event, they'll land, refuel, get more flares, and go back and hit the same storm. That happens maybe a couple times a winter, I'm guessing. So they're not that common.
So the answer was 3 to 4 hours is your average.
For these cases, they're seeding for 3 to 4 hours generally.
And how are you measuring those to make that determination of that duration of a seedable event?
How are the forecasters determining that? That's a great question. I can go out on a limb and guess that they're using forecast models. If there are observations, I don't know if the current aerial program has any. I don't think there are many observations right now, but I'll talk at the end of my presentation about how some cloud seeding programs find it helpful to have certain types of measurements to help guide, so that they know, is it a good case before they even launch the aircraft? Because in this program, they would have to launch that aircraft to be able to get up there and really test to say, yeah, there's supercooled water in this.
Your question answered then? Okay, Senator.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator, I I think that our models have definitely come a long way and are a lot more accurate than they used to be. When we compare these models with observations like we've been doing in Snowy, we have a lot of observations that we collected in Snowy for this very reason. We can get really good comparisons. However, this is where that ensemble thing comes in. If we run 36 simulations, some of them will compare very well, but not all of them will. And so one of our challenges overall in weather science is still the predictability of weather and being able to know beforehand if that model simulation is going to be good. So I don't think I can put a number on it right now, but I definitely feel like we have made a major transformation from the days of just using statistical studies where there's also a lot of uncertainty in those, and that we have a new approach to measure and quantify what we or estimate what we think these cloud seeding effects are in ways that we couldn't before. Because in those old statistical studies as well, you were looking at a single point, a single snow gauge. And now we can actually estimate spatial maps of these. I don't have this in my presentation, but we have some really good data where we run these high resolution models and compare it with like SNOWTEL snow gauge network. This is one of the reasons we knew that the models had come far enough to be able to start doing stuff like cloud seeding simulations, is because we can now simulate precipitation amounts in the mountains that match what we see in the SNOWTEL data in ways that we never could before, thanks to supercomputers and running in higher resolution. So I think we're a lot better off than we were, but I do recognize there are still uncertainties in it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So this particular study year, was it a year that had lots of the appropriate events? In other words, it takes a certain kind of cloud to be seedable before it's going to really have an effect. And so was this particular year a good year, a good water year, a poor water year? And then if you, for example, if it was a poor water year and then you looked at this last year, which we know in that basin had an incredible amount of snow, do you think that you would see a linear, a linear result between the two? In other words, if you have more events, is that going to be a linear increase from the seeding based upon your modeling, or is it more than a linear increase? Or do you have any idea on that?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker, let me first address that last one about the linearity. I don't think it's necessarily going to be linear, because it's not just the number of storms that we have, but it's the types of storms we have. If they are deep, really juicy storms that are really producing snow very efficiently on their own, they might not have as much supercooled liquid in it for us to kind of squeeze out of the cloud with cloud seeding. So it's really factors of the numbers of storms as well as the types of storms. On the water year question, I want to defer to Dr. Doherty online, because she's been studying the hydrology and she can talk a little bit more about the water year, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So regarding the water year, during the year of from 2019 to 2020, that was a dry year, looking at the soil moisture starting in October 2019 and ending with the soil moisture in October of 2020. The preceding year for the water year, again, looking at soil moisture, was a wetter year. So there was a gain in soil moisture throughout that water year from October 2018 to October of 2019. So those water years did differ. And that is one caveat of the study, is that, you know, things are going to differ year to year based on temperature, based on the storms you get, and based on the soil moisture that's received throughout the year.
And I hate to keep repeating the same question everybody's asking, but I was wondering if maybe we could get a number that's best case scenario, worst case scenario, how it's working. Is that, you know, I realize that every time you do it, you're going to get a little bit better, a little worse results, but we should be able to get something on that order of, well, the best case is going to be around this, and our typical worst case is going to be around here. And then we can kind of tell, you know, how it's performing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that some of that we can learn from the climatological analyses that look over the, past so many years at how often conditions are occurring. But the best way to do it is to really try to simulate these cases, just to look at what I mentioned to Mr. Speaker over here, how the nature of the storms and how effectively they're producing precipitation on their own is another factor that we can simulate now. So these types of evaluations are like the step in that direction for really being able to do that. So I hope that maybe helps address that. And then Aaron, I think we can turn it over to you for us to keep presenting. Is that okay, Mr. Chairman? Okay.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, she was providing the introduction for, how we simulate the cloud seeding using a weather model. And the second tool that we are using is the WRF hydro model. That is a hydrologic model. And so that's going to simulate the multiple things within the land surface. So you can see the schematic here is showing the various components of this hydrologic model. So we have a land surface model, which is receiving information from that WRF weather mod of the state of the atmosphere. So the different fluxes in the atmosphere, all those different variables you see listed here. And then we're also coupling that within the hydrologic model to terrain routing. That is basically modeling the movement of water through the land surface, also into streams and rivers. And then we're also simulating the water, not only at the land surface, so in the soil moisture in the stream, but also below ground in the groundwater and in the storage. So we really have all these different components of the land surface and movement of the water between the atmosphere and the land surface being simulated in WRF hydro. And so in order to run this model, we basically take ensembles of forcing data for the entire water year. So again, we're simulating from 2019 to 2020 during the same time, overlapping with those seeding cases. And during the dates when we don't have seeding occur, we feed in this high resolution meteorological data set. And then during the dates of the actual seeding, we are stitching in that WRF weather mod. So again, that model has 36 ensemble members. So essentially at each of those seeding dates, we're stitching in 36 ensemble members. And then those meteorological forcings are fed into WRF hydro. And from WRF hydro, we are spitting out 36 ensemble members. And I don't know if you can see that, but those are hydrographs being shown there. So we basically have 36 realizations of the stream flow and what's happening within this hydrologic model. So again, like Sarah said, we are capturing that uncertainty and the range of possibilities through the different model configurations, even through the stream flow. So next slide, please. So there's a question asked of, how well are the models doing? This is an important step that we took within the WRF hydro modeling framework. And so the domain for WRF hydro is shown on your left there. So you see the terrain height in meters. So you can see the Sierra Madre and the Medicine Bow ranges pretty nicely there. In the thick black outline, this is showing the outline of the North Platte River Basin, as well as the Little Snake River Basin, which were shown in previous slides. And then the smaller, thinner black outlines are showing smaller river basins. So these are really important for, calibrating the model and making sure it's performing well. And then in the black dots here and the numbers, these are actually the locations of the USGS stream gauges, which we used to calibrate our model to make sure that it is comparing well to the observed stream flow at those different gauges. So in order to run WRF hydro, we did a long simulation from October 1999 to October 2021. That included 5 years of spin up time, and that's to make sure that we're representing the land surface state accurately and it reaches some sort of equilibrium. And we have to run the model for a long time, again, to make sure that we're properly simulating all these different fluxes from the land surface all the way down to the stream flow. And so I'll show you an example of how WRF hydro performed. This particular gauge is the Medicine Bow River near Elk Mountain in Wyoming. And so the model, so the WRF hydro model, The stream flow values are shown in blue lines. And then the observed stream flow, which the observed flow was less than the time the model was run, is shown in the red dots. So you can see that between Wharf Hydro and the observations, you see a really nice track and agreement with where you see peaks and dips in the stream flow. If you're interested in more of the statistics, they're all listed here. But overall, we did this for 17 of those different USGS gauges, and they all showed really great performance and comparison with observations. So we trust the model, and we know that it compares well to observations, so we can use this to look at the impact of seeding. Next slide, please. So we ran this with those seeding cases, as I mentioned. And so what you're seeing here is the result for the ensemble mean stream flow. So taking the ensemble mean across those 36 ensemble members. And again, we're showing the Upper North Platte and also the Little Snake Basin. These are broken down into smaller hydrologic units. That's the way we analyze things. It's a little easier to do it with the smaller subbasins. And we're showing basically the seeding effect. So how much additional stream flow do we gain from cloud seeding? So anywhere you see blue is increasing, and we really don't see any reds on here, so no decreases. You can see the numbers by individual river basins. So you can see the control stream flow. So without seeding, what is the stream flow in acre feet, the seeded stream flow, and then the difference. So what is the seeding effect? If you basically sum up all of those basins totals, we see that the seeding effect results in nearly 7,000 more acre feet across this whole domain for the ensemble mean. And so obviously this differs by ensemble member, but the mean result shows that 7,000 acre feet increase. Next slide, please. So there was earlier a question about the water budget and how did things look in the previous year compared to the year of seeding. So they anticipated this slide, I suppose. So this is the water budget for the water year 2019. And so the water budget, you have inputs and you have outputs. The inputs are precipitation, and then this is balanced by stream flow, evapotranspiration, and then also this water that's in the soil. So storage term has soil moisture and groundwater. And so this schematic is showing where does the water go given the change in precipitation from seeding. So we're looking at that change. So just over the single water year for the ensemble mean, we see that 78% of the precipitation from seeding goes to an increase in stream flow. Next, it goes to a 21% increase in storage. So basically you're having increased soil moisture and groundwater. And then 8% of that is going towards evapotranspiration. So basically what's left over. And so these can vary year to year, as I mentioned in the earlier question. And really it depends on what is the climate. Sorry, could you repeat the question? I can't hear you online.
No, we didn't have.
No question?
Just have been some feedback.
Okay, can I continue? Okay. Yeah, again, please feel free to ask questions. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything online. So yeah, as I was saying, this partitioning of precipitation can differ from year to year, depending on things like temperature, soil moisture, the number of storms you get. There's a number of different terms that can alter this. So these exact numbers can change year to year. And also this is the ensemble mean result. So we also see some variation depending on, which of the 36 ensemble members that we are looking at. So if you go to the next slide, please, Sarah will pick up and look at the cost benefit analysis by ensemble member.
Thanks, Erin. So one of the final components of this study was to turn this into cost per acre feet. And so since we have actual estimates in terms of acre feet and the operational costs provided by the Water Development Office. We were able to do this based on that ensemble mean amount of precipitation that was produced, that about 9,500 acre feet would turn into a cost per acre foot of about $60. That ensemble mean is shown here on the left as that solid line across this scatter plot. And then the scattered points are each of those different ensemble members that represent the variability depending on what that ensemble member produced as the estimated seeding effect. So we can look at that full range then where the ensemble maximum produced about 14,000 acre feet would translate to a cost per acre foot of $40. The ensemble minimum of about 6,000 acre feet would translate to about $90 per acre foot. We can also do this as well with the hydrological model output on stream flow, where that ensemble mean that Aaron just presented was just about 7,000 acre feet. Cost would be $81 per acre foot. And then the min and the max stream flow estimates from that ensemble would give us a range of, for the minimum, $125 per acre foot about and $56 per acre foot. So you can see a lot of variability about those mean values, the mean values here shown in the horizontal lines. But again, that's one of the reasons that we run this ensemble, is in order to try to capture some of that variability and uncertainty that's within the model.
Doctor, I think we'd all like to get a copy of that page at some point in the near future.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Speaker.
Chairman, thank you. So obviously this is an augmentation to the system versus like the cost of water in the system. But even that price is a drop, small compared to the cost of water. But as compared to the cost of augmentation, other types of augmentation, did you guys take a look at any analysis there? So whether it's, converting salt water to fresh water, any other type of augmentation out there, did you take a look to see what that?
Sure, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker, we did not. My area of focus is on cloud seeding research, but that is certainly, something that I expect that this commission and others will be looking into. Any other questions, Mr. Chairman?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, on those all-in costs, the operating costs, does that include all federal grants, all state money match, everything that's included? I thought the number was higher. That's the reason why I'm asking. Could you tell me what that includes, the operational cost?
Okay, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator. These costs were provided by the Water Development Office. My understanding is that they are the Wyoming state funds that were put in for the aerial program for the Medicine Bow and Sierra Madre ranges. Julie? And funding partner money included.
Senator, you want to follow up, or are you okay? Okay.
If I can
Senator
get
Hicks.
So a question back when you calculated your average stream augmentation, and we get to the 7,000 K. I'm curious as the statistical analysis and a determination of what your standard deviation is pre and then when you run the model. So if you take all of those same USGS gauging stations over the period of record that you utilized and put that information in there, you can calculate and come up with a standard deviation of your accuracy of what your average flow was during that time period. You could do that same thing for the model and come up. What I'm curious is how statistically accurate are the assumptions that you made going in statistically accurate going into this? Because when I just run the rough calculations and I look at the 7,000 acre feet of augmentation and I look at the total discharge out of those two basins, the North Platte and the Little Snake, if we look at an aggregate of 7,000 acre feet of increase, and we just look at the percentage of what the overall yield in those two basins is, it's over 1 million acre feet a year on average. And so we're talking 7,000. That's 7%. It's less than 1%. And so when I look at those kind of numbers, I want to know what the accuracy of the data is. And my guess is the error within the model is greater than 0.7%. It's less than 1%. And so what statistical analysis can you tell me that you looked at to validate to what the standard deviation is within that range to make a determination? Is this just noise? 7,000 acre feet out of 1,000,000 acre feet of yield? Or is there some statistical validity tested at what level to say, yeah, the numbers are probably accurate within the normal range of variation?
Understood. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator, I'm going to defer to Aaron and possibly Dave, who are our wharf hydro experts on that model.
Thank you
Were
for the
you
question.
able to hear the question, Aaron?
Yes, I heard the question crystal clear. So thank you for that. I can answer first, and then Dave, if there's anything else you would like to add, feel free to jump in once I'm finished. So thank you for the great question. That is a very astute observation. As I previously mentioned, we did do a statistical analysis to compare how well wharf hydro is doing compared to observations. I understand your question is about the natural variability within the observations and what that is compared to the variability of cloud seeding. And that is not something that we have specifically looked at. And as Sarah mentioned before, we would not expect to see, massive increases in these cloud seeding values. But I can't say for certainty what the natural variability is compared to cloud seeding variability, as those are two very different things. But we do have confidence in this model, given that it was run 36 times for 27 cloud seeding cases. And that I will mention, and I did not show this, but the bias domain-wide amongst those 17 stream gauges, so the observations compared to wharf hydro without any cloud seeding, the bias is 3%. It's a very small bias that we see over the whole domain. So wharf hydro is really reproducing what we see in observation. So I think we can have confidence that what we're seeing is the effect of cloud seeding. Thank you.
Dave, is Dave online? I think Mr. Chairman, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to hear also from our other hydrologist, Dave Gochis, who created the wharf hydro model. Dave, are you on?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me, Sarah?
Yes. Hello.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator, thank you for the question. I think this is a very good question. I think Aaron has given you essentially the breadth of the information that we have available based on the experiments that we ran. There are certainly different types of uncertainty that can and probably should be probed further. Aaron mentioned relying on issues related to the interannual variability of precipitation and runoff processes, but that the model does tend to track those fairly well. There are the other uncertainties, as you mentioned, sir, related to the measurement uncertainty, and that would get into a deeper analysis as to whether or not those types of errors end up being systematic or whether they end up being random. And the importance of that is that systematic errors translate through the model in a fairly systematic way, versus random errors are what really cloud the uncertainty or complicate what we would call the signal to noise that's coming out of this particular system. So there is certainly more work that could be done to try to pull those different components apart that would go well beyond the initial scope of this work. But as Aaron mentioned, the ability of the model to translate the impact of just changes in the meteorological conditions into the hydrologic response, I feel like we have fairly good confidence on. And if additional work is needed to pull out what some other sources of uncertainty are and whether or not they're contributing to something that's systematic versus something that's a bit more random, then those would need to be handled separately.
And just on another line of thought, just in particular, how much of this water do data
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator, this study quantified the amount within the basin that we showed on the map. It does not quantify how and where it would be stored. So that would be beyond the scope of what this study has looked at and beyond the scope of my ability to respond to, unfortunately.
Chairman, I could just, based on, it's going to be in the creeks. So a senior water right, direct flow water user could divert that water just like they do now. Or if there's a reservoir that needs to be filled, that water could go into a reservoir. So it would be handled just like natural flow would be at this point.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and it really determines, because it's going to come back to depend on what watershed it is. So if it's in the North Platte, we have a North Platte decree that allocates that water a direct stream flow amongst the states. So technically, not practically, but technically, whatever water, if it's determined that this is direct stream flow, is going to be allocated out to those states. Same as the Colorado. So any increase technically would come in, would be portion of Wyoming, 14% of the Colorado that came into the Little Snake. So I think there could be a case to be made that, and we've had these discussions on some issues within some of the compacts, that if you bring in import water or create new water, that's not subject. But because this does end up as natural stream flow, my assumption would be that that's going to be subject to the allocations amongst those compacts and those different river basins. So in effect, out of that 7,000 acre feet, at least in the Little Snake, we'd get 14% of that in Wyoming, and the rest would belong to those other upper basin states. Similar on the North Platte. I don't remember what the percentage breakout between Wyoming and Nebraska is on those. So
Mr. Chairman, ultimately on the Colorado River, what it also does is help satisfy our compact compliance at Lee's Ferry. So if we're not using it all and we're sending some water down the river, we're not violating the compact, and ultimately that will help us. It's a benefit to have water in the Colorado system, I can guarantee you. Anyway, any kind of water.
yeah, and I would agree with that, right up as to who's paying for Colorado to have Colorado's water, because they get 53% of that water that's produced by Wyoming taxpayers funding the cloud seeding. So I agree, it's water, it's system water, it's allocated out. So I want to back up on the question again, as far as, so I'm trying to get my confidence of the data. And so when we look at the number of ensembles and we look at the mean and then look at the range, we see about a 30% variation. So if we take the minimum of 6,000 and the maximum of 14,000, it tells me there's about a 38% variation from the high and the low, and then we projected a mean in there, which is fine. But it shows me there's 30% variation in the model based on the high and the low. It could be any of those scenarios. That mean kind of a de facto comes back to be a certain level of standard deviation within there. So we're just saying that's the average of all the runs of the model.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator, I will add, like I mentioned earlier, the more observations that we have, the better that we could kind of tune how to interpret this ensemble. Because I don't know, I have pretty good confidence in this full range of solutions, but if that mean is perfectly calibrated is actually a question I don't have a good answer to, because, you know, we don't have observations that I need in every single case to say that our ensemble in every single case is adequately, that the mean of the ensemble is capturing the observations best. You know, if the observation is in that outer edge of the spread too many times, then that mean might not be represented. So I agree. Right now, this is the best of our quantifying and estimating these impacts to this range of uncertainty that we have, that we are living with. But I do think that this approach over past studies where it's statistical measurements at a single point that we then have to extrapolate over large areas and that have its own source of uncertainty, I think that this approach is quite novel and going to be transforming this field of trying to understand what the impacts of cloud seeding are. And we do have work to do to reduce these uncertainties more, to gain as much confidence in the model as we can, to address some of the issues that Dave Goches just brought up and Aaron described in answer to your question. But this has come really a long way in where we were decades ago with cloud seeding and understanding those impacts. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Chairman, Doctor, after looking through some of these numbers and considering 7,000 acre feet, 14% of acre feet, the amount of money. Hello? Okay. The numbers work out to be approximately $580 an acre foot for the state of Wyoming is what our cost is and the amount of money we put into it in rough numbers. And it just seems pretty high. I mean, is this really the best place? And after knowing that, to spend money on cloud seeding? I mean, that waits to be evaluated, but the number seems very high, and I don't know what else we do, for the state of Wyoming. And I guess I wish to know more about that verification. What is the cost for Wyoming's benefit for the amount of money that we put in the program? And so basically, what's it costing per acre foot? A real simple question. Maybe we can get that. Maybe you can come up and help me with that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Senator, I do believe that the costs, and maybe we can minimize the video window, the cost per acre foot have been calculated based on these different estimates here on the screen. And those are the best estimates that we have at this time. And the decision whether that is the place to be putting the money is not mine to make. So I will, present our results of our study as we have found them and hand it over to the good decision makers to make decisions with that information.
Like to, I guess, have a little bit more conversation about the 14% with Senator Hicks to make sure we're not, I guess, misrepresenting that a little bit. Because let's say we have an additional 500 acre feet, just throwing a number out there, in a little Snake River Basin. There's nothing that says we can only take 14% of that in a given water year. So if there was an additional 500 acre feet at this dollar amount, Wyoming has the right to use that water. It's only in a curtailment, I think, where you would be limited to make up any water that the 75 year or 75 million in 10. So I guess I'm not quite sure I'm understanding we can only use 14% of it in a given year if that was water produced from cloud seeding in that year. Because I think Senator Kolb is basically taking that and then dividing it by 14% to come up with 500 and some odd dollars.
Yeah, and I didn't want to really start into this, but from the technical aspect, we're allocated 14% of the yield out of the Colorado River Basin on the compact. The practical application is another thing. Sure, we can divert it. We're still obligated to, and we don't utilize all ours in the Colorado, opposite of the North Platte, which is fully allocated for the most part, other than really wet years. So you get the legal side of it that says you're entitled to 14% of the water. That's the total yield in the Little Snake and the Green River Basin. The total aggregate 14%. So we can use up to that, and then we're no longer until there's a compact to call. And at that point in time, we're going to be restricted to that, which we're moving in that direction. So it's however you want to characterize it, the legal aspect or the practical aspect of the water.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of it more, Mr. Chairman, on the practical aspect. 14% is a volume, more or less, right? And I think we have not developed 14%. I mean, that's up for debate, right? In Wyoming, so
No,
we
we
still
have
have
not.
room for
That's
development.
not up for debate.
So
We
we
have
could,
not.
okay, so we could pretty much satisfy all of our existing rights and still be within our 14%.
That's correct. That's the current situation.
Right.
It is.
So in a particular water year, it's very, I guess, abnormal for us to have 100% satisfaction of our water rights throughout the entire season. So if you add a little water with cloud seeding, I would think Wyoming and our users with their existing rights could divert that water.
Okay, if we're gonna go down this road, now
Well,
we got to get
I'm
into the
just-
whole science of
Yeah.
cloud seeding, because that water comes off at the
Probably
same
not.
time as the hydrological peak as it normally does.
Yeah.
So it doesn't put any late season water in the system. Cloud seeding doesn't accomplish that. That's been pretty much scientifically documented. So the most of that water comes off during the normal peak of the hydrograph because you've increased the snow melt. So you slightly increase the runoff potential and a little bit on the legs either side. When you get to the increase in the very end of the hydrograph, it does not put more water in the system in July, August, September, and October. Doesn't do that. And so the only way for us to benefit under those scenarios is to put that in storage and carry it over for those dry years. And that's the real benefit of any cloud seeding and augmentation, is if you have the reservoir capacity to store that on those wet years. But it does not put water into the system late into the year. So getting back to your scenario of diversions, at the time that we need diversions is the time that that snow water increase is not available. Because it come off when the river's at high water, we're already at double or free river scenarios. There's more water in the system during high flows than all the appropriators in the Green River Basin can possibly divert. So we don't need it then. That's when that snow augmentation water comes off. So in effect, we are moving that water downstream to those lower basin states under the current cloud seeding, unless you can store it and carry it over.
Right. So in the example, your backyard, High Savory doesn't fill every year. So you might be able to put some additional water into High Savory
Yeah,
to store it. Right. So I guess it's not as simple as just 14%.
well, I would
practically,
agree
but-
with that. There's the
Yeah.
whole legal and then the practical applications and then the hydrograph and when does the snow come off and where does the water go?
Okay.
If
I
you
just
want
don't
to
want
color
it to
it,
be misconstrued as take the number, divide by 14, and that's what it costs Wyoming. Because it's not that simple.
it's not that simple. I would agree with that characterization.
Right.
Keep this argument going, but so one thing that Senator Hicks said is not accurate, in my opinion, and that is that at high water, that all water rights are satisfied. I've seen in our valley on some of those creeks that they start out in regulation right off the bat. There never was any. So in a bad year, those creeks are bad right from the get-go, regulated right off the chute, right from the time the water is turned on. So that's not always, and that's only some creeks, but it does happen. And once again, I just want to say that water in the system helps satisfy our obligation at Lee's Ferry, which is ultimately going to be the axe that hurts Wyoming agriculture, hurts Wyoming industry, hurts Wyoming municipalities. The more water we can put into the system, the more it's going to help Wyoming.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I probably made too broad a brush with that. I only meant those main stem irrigators on the Green River.
Chairman, one other thing I'd like to point out too, just for information, that's what this is, to get everybody information on the cloud seeding. is in the Colorado River Basin. Wyoming participates up to 37%, and then the other 63% come from downstream contributors and other contributors to the Wyoming cloud seeding program. So we don't pay 100% of the Colorado River Basin cloud seeding.
I have just one or two more, but this has been great discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and everyone. So one of the other things that this study was asked to do was provide recommendations if there were opportunities to optimize the cloud seeding operational efficiency, or ways to better monitor and evaluate the program going forward. And as I have made the mention earlier, observations are a key component of that. There are certain observations that I list on this slide that would benefit not only forecasting for cloud seeding, as we discussed earlier. That instrument on the aircraft has been really vital to this study, but we only get data when it's in flight. And the forecasters only know what that aircraft is going to measure when it's in flight. So they don't really have that data on the ground. Whereas a multi-channel microwave radiometer, which looks like a mailbox, to be honest, it's pictured in the upper left, is on the ground constantly measuring the liquid water in the atmosphere. So those are really helpful for forecasting cloud seeding programs, and would also then be helpful for an evaluation to provide a constant long time series of liquid water measurements. Other measurements that are helpful are snow gauges with really high temporal and measurement resolution. Snowtail gauges, there are some in the mountains, but they're hourly to daily resolution. And these seeding events are so much shorter than that, that their measurement resolution isn't as helpful for these types of studies. Also, weather balloons, or we call them atmospheric soundings, also can help give forecasters an idea what the temperatures of the cloud are, if they're good temperatures for seeding, and then they also provide data for evaluation. I'll point out in this list of observations, as Julie mentioned at the beginning, the Bureau of Reclamation has provided some federal funds to augment the Upper Basin state programs, and Wyoming is going to be using some of that money from the Bureau then to put in place a radiometer in the next year or two for augmenting the operations in this region. Another component of our recommendations, more costly, but it does have a broader use than just for cloud seeding, would be what I call gap filling radars. As I mentioned earlier, the NexRad radar network doesn't measure over the mountains very well. There are gaps that are there because of the mountains themselves. And so for National Weather Service forecasting purposes, they don't have any information over the mountains. For hydrological studies, trying to figure out how much precipitation was falling, but also for our ability to see those zigzag patterns more often, radars that fill those gaps are also very helpful to have. So in summary, this study included two components: the design and calibration of a computer modeling evaluation approach that tied together the WRF weather model with the WRF hydro model to look at both precipitation and streamflow impacts, and then using that system to evaluate one season of aerial cloud seeding. So using this system, the impacts of cloud seeding have been estimated on both precipitation and streamflow for that 2019-2020 season, and those results are summarized again in the tables on the right. I'll also point out that we do expect there to be year-to-year variability. As Aaron described, from the hydrological side, different soil moisture, different temperatures can be factors in runoff and timing of runoff, but also from the meteorological perspective, as we discussed earlier, the numbers of storms each winter and the types and characteristics of those storms will vary. So one way to characterize and better quantify that year-to-year variability would be to conduct more intense evaluation of additional seasons. And then the last point that I just made about some additional observations would help reduce some of the uncertainty in these model results, as well as some of those observations that I had on that previous slide would also help improve the forecasting to optimize the operational seeding opportunities. Thank you so much for your attention and all of the interest and discussion today.
Follow-up comments? Well, great job. Very interesting. We're all looking forward to seeing the report as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congratulate your team.
Will do.
Mr. Chairman, so I'd like to have a short discussion over the next couple of days for some of the folks new to the Select Water Committee. Where we're going to be doing is reviewing recommendations from our office for funding all the applications we received as of September 1 from the construction projects, as well as kind of rehashing not applications because we don't know what the validity of next year's projects are going to look like. You know, they may be really good projects. We don't want to spend all the money this year, knowing we've got projects coming next year, and we've done that for years like that. With the applications we've received, and I'm talking about planning, construction, cloud seeding, UW water research, we're looking at about $42 million worth of demand on the program. So little over $18 million to spend, $40+ million of demand that we're trying to address. The folks that were here last year, what we looked at was when we had a project that came in and asked for design and construction dollars, we took a look at that and said, okay, are they going to be ready for construction dollars right off the bat? Because what we've seen in previous years is, especially with more municipal projects, our easements tend to hold up construction dollars because it takes time to get through those easements. So last year we started looking at how ready is a project to fund. The projects that came in the door looking for construction or pre-construction, design, easements, all that stuff, and construction. A lot of times agricultural projects can move along pretty quickly because you're, putting a ditch into pipe, you already have the easements in place. It's fairly simple. Not as simple sometimes with municipal projects. So we tended to fund pre-construction of a project and then said, come back when you've got design to about 50%, you've got all your easements in place. By doing that, we're not holding on to construction or program dollars that could go to a project that's more shovel ready this year. And we're not holding that money for a year or two down the road, right? We can get it on the ground now. So you're going to see that same thing or same thought process this year of doing that. The other thing is, and this is fairly major, over the years, we've been able to give out 67% grants. We went away from that this year. We went to 50% grants. So most everybody, there was a couple that only asked for 50%, but most everybody was asking for 67% in our construction projects. So we're looking at 50% grants. We reached out to all of our sponsors to make sure that wasn't going to cause an issue based on the financing we looked at through our planning studies. I think the overwhelming majority, if not 100% of them, came back and said, we will take what we can get And we appreciate the program, working with us on this. So didn't have any major pushback that would cause problems. The other thing is with that 50%, what we're trying to do, and we've been preaching this a lot, I guess, since I've become the director, is we need to maximize federal dollars, not maximize state dollars. And in the past, I think we've been the easy program to come to get 67%. Water Smart, for example, through Bureau of Reclamation, they'll go up 50% up to $2 million. And we want to make sure our sponsors are maximizing those federal dollars. So this more or less forces them to go get the maximum from other federal programs. The other thing is we're working with sponsors to understand too, if they've got large projects that potentially are federal eligible for some of these federal programs. Again, Water Smart is very popular. It only funds projects up to $4 million. So if we see that and we see a larger project that would fit under that, we talk to those sponsors about potentially phasing those, because then we can take, over a couple of years and breaking a project up into smaller chunks to where they can go get that federal money for each phase. And again, further extend state dollars by leveraging that money. The other thing is some sponsors asked for loans, and we are not going to provide loans. I think our thought is that our money now is best utilized in grant money, because again, you're basically getting, by giving out a 50% grant right now, you're getting 100% return on that by getting a 50% match. And if we put that into a loan over time, project costs go up by the time we get that money. The buying power of that dollar isn't as great in the future. And I feel like if we can put that out as a grant now and get that match, we're going to get the most work done on the ground as possible. Not to mention, interest rates have gone up. Senator Hicks brought that up in the August meeting. We don't want to be competing with the private sector when it comes to providing loans. So that was another thought about not providing loans. And I don't think we had any issues with sponsor pushback on that. What we've seen in some instances in the past is a sponsor will get a loan and then go get that federal money and then revert the loan. So we don't want, again, we're just holding up money for a time period. And this, again, incentivizes those sponsors to go out and get that federal funding. And we'll hold their hands as much as we can to help them with that. The next thing is, as you recall, in our May meeting, we approved quite a few planning projects. And that was to the tune of about, now that we've got consultant selection done and prices, it's about $6.4 million worth of planning studies. We've got one particular project that we'll talk about, I think it's tomorrow, that's $2 million alone, and it's a well project. So in our recommendations, we thought, okay, well, you take that $2 million project and compare it to all of our master plans or other planning projects that we had. For that $2 million, if we cut that project, we can basically save 8 or 9 master plans. And in the situation we talked about back in May, in difficulty in getting consultants interested in doing work for us in our planning studies, and not interested, I shouldn't say, but the fact that we don't see a lot of out-of-state consultants anymore because how the statutes are set up. In some instances, we're only getting one consultant per planning project. So we want to keep them coming back to the trough and helping us with these planning studies. And if we were to turn around and say, okay, we're not going to fund 8 projects that 8 consultants went through the feasibility or the consultant selection process, put proposals together, spent $10,000 to $15,000 each on those, we may discourage consultants in participating in the future. Not to mention, we've got 8 sponsors that would lose out versus 1 sponsor. Those 8 master plans that we've at least recommended to fund also will be, I guess, laying out as part of those master plans. When we come up with the list of projects and their rehabilitation plan or their roadmap on how to modernize their system, take care of their issues that they've got in priority, that's going to set them up. And we've I also put a focus on in our master plans. Let's not just give us the list of funding programs that are out there. We all know the lists that are out there. It's not a copy paste situation here. We want to know this project matches up with this program and what's the information that sponsor is going to need to then apply for that program. So I feel like with our recommendations of funding these master plans over that one project, we're setting these sponsors up to be able to, again, leverage federal funding, which in the long term is going to help water development and state funds go along further because we're leveraging more dollars. We're giving them a tool in these master plans. And then the last thing I would just like to say is we're trying to do our best to distribute the money the best we can. Again, with that thought of one project versus 8 or 9 projects, that comes into play there too. So that's what you're going to see tomorrow. We've got, I think, a couple of other master plans that aren't quite to the entity status. Back in May, I know the commission approved going forward. They're working on becoming an entity. But when we look at all the sponsors that are already entities, it wouldn't be fair to fund the ones that aren't entities before we fund the ones that already are entities. I know there's probably been, so we're trying to work within the funding that we have, spread it out as much as we can. I would ask if there's any questions on that thought process at this point.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director Mead, 2-part question. First, timing wise, when a sponsor seeks out federal funding, is the timing sufficient enough that allows them to accomplish the project in a time frame that's based on the project specifically? As I look at the counterintuitive process of permitting, it takes an incredible amount of time. I hope that there's some work or if you have some comments as it relates to the federal funding and the timing of that. My second part of the question is this. We spoke briefly last time, maybe it was last year. How do we ensure, what is the strategy moving forward by the division to ensure that when a project is at $250,000, we get one bidder and it's $249,999? How do we compress that, or more importantly, attract more bidders so we have a better quality of bidding so that we're not taking for $1 less every time there's the requested amount and there's only one potential contractor?
So I'll address the second part of your question because it's fresh in my mind. The planning studies, I think 250, 240, you get it for $249.99 comment. Our planning studies are competitively bid now. In the past, we would set the budgets within the office and then put it out on the street. And we would see most consultants come in right at that budget, which was a lot easier to compare apples to apples because we're getting the scope we want and we can compare from one spot or one consultant to the other. How much more are we getting from you for $250,000 versus the other person by looking at their proposals? Now we go out and we say, we want to do this project. Here's a scope of work. Send us proposals in. We're not going to open the bids or the price to do those proposals. We're not setting the budget in advance. So the consultants are coming back, and sometimes we see, like I've said in the past, it's the Lexus versus the Toyota, right? And you see it in the cost. So it's a little bit harder to compare. And do you want all the bells and whistles, or are we just trying to get done what we're trying to get done to answer the need questions? So in the future, the other thing I'd like to mention is we've got ourselves into a little bit of a situation this year because we approved the planning in advance, and what I already talked about with, we don't want to pull the rug out from underneath these consultants and these sponsors at this point. I think in the future, and we talked about this a little bit in August, is I think we need to probably cap to a percentage or something what we're going to spend on planning each year. If we choose to continue the work to have it competitively bid, we'll do the best we can as a staff to estimate, this, we think it's going to cost $250,000. This one, we might cost $150,000, but it's going to be just that, an estimate. So if we say it's 15 to 20%, of the money we have to spend, $2.5 to $3 million we're going to spend on planning every year. And we say, okay, well, here's all the applications we have in, here's how we've kind of prioritized them. We think this one's going to cost this much, this much, this much. We've got 200 or 2.5 or $3.5 million worth of studies in front of you as recommended to approve. And then we go through that proposal process and our estimates are off and we come in at, $500,000 more than what we had estimated. We need some leeway, right? Or we go back to our old way of thinking and say, let's set the budgets. We know then what we're going to be spending that year. So that's one thought. I don't know if that answered that second part of the question.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, clarifying question. So if I understood correctly from your testimony, specifically, as we look at number one, Bridge Valley Joint Powers Board tank replacement 2024, you ask or submit bids or RFPs for that tank replacement, but you do not share with them the requested or more importantly, the recommended funding component. Is that correct?
Well, you're looking at a level 3 construction.
Yeah,
project
I'm using
there.
it as an example.
Yeah. So if you go down, too far. Okay, the bottom section, level 1 projects, Bighorn Canal ID master plan. That's an example of a study. So we might have set the budget at 250. Now we just put out a scope of work. We get, let's say, 3 consultants interested in doing the job. They all put proposals together. We go through, and I know you aren't part of this, but our commission is part of the selection committee, as well as our sponsors are part of that selection committee and our staff for each project. We get proposals, we get price proposals as well, not just a proposal on how they're going to do the work, the scope of work, and also the price to do it.
So for again, clarity, the consultants that you're asking don't know that the funding amount is $289,000.
Correct. We went through that whole process
Yeah,
I just described, and the winning consultant is 289. We plugged that in there now.
Gotcha.
That's going to be
Thank
in
you.
the omnibus bill. Sorry, that wasn't a very good explanation on my part. The question about permitting.
Or by midnight. Specifically as it relates to when we talk about federal funding or grants, is a time frame achievable for respective sponsors to get the work done? I mean, is it a delayed process, 5-10 years to get that funding?
No, I don't think so. I think, Mr. Chairman, these water smart programs, I think they're set up, they're fairly streamlined. Yes, it might take a little bit of time because sometimes it's a chicken and the egg versus, hey, do you have your matching funds? Well, state, we're asking the same question to them, right? Do you have your federal funds? I think we're getting better at trying to meld up our different process timelines, but usually we have five years to complete a construction project. That's the typical, and we haven't seen any issues with completing those because of the federal funding that's coming in. Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments? Any other discussion? Seeing none, do we have a motion to adjourn? Second? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Chair.